Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The tracks changed species halfway across the clearing, wolf to human to something that walked on joints bent backwards. Robert Fitzgerald had been documenting animal movement patterns in the Grand Teton backcountry for 11 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything that violated the basic principles of mammalian locomotion. Until now. He crouched beside the trail at mile marker 4, Evan on the Cascades Canyon Trail, his Garmin GPS unit reading 7,240 feet elevation, and photographed what shouldn't exist. The morning had started with data. It always did. Robert kept meticulous records, weather conditions, wildlife sightings, trail maintenance needs, all logged into a custom spreadsheet he'd designed himself. September 17, 2014. Temperature 43° arm at dawn, barometric pressure 24.89 inches, wind from the northwest at 6 knots, clear skies, visibility excellent, everything quantifiable, everything explainable. Tyler Dawson had been missing for 36 hours. The initial report had come through standard channels. 23-year-old male, solo hiker, permit filed for a 3-day trek through Paintbrush Canyon with a return via Cascade. His Subaru remained in the String Lake Trailhead parking lot, keys locked inside as per protocol. His emergency contact, a sister in Boise, hadn't heard from him since his scheduled check-in time passed. Everything about the case fit the statistical profile for a routine search and rescue operation, except for the tracks. Robert adjusted his Nikon settings, ensuring proper exposure for the evidence. The morning sun cut through the lodgepole pines at an angle that highlighted every depression in the soil. The sequence was impossible. Canis lupus prints, 4-toed, clawed, measuring approximately 4.5 inches in length, crossed from the tree line heading southwest, standard wolf behavior for this region. Then, in the space of a single stride, the tracks transformed. Human barefoot prints, adult male by the proportions, toes clearly defined. 5 paces. Then something else entirely. The final tracks showed a gait too wide for human anatomy. The foot placement suggested a bipedal creature, but the knee joint had to be reversed, bending backward like a bird's leg, to produce this stride pattern. The depth of the impressions indicated significant weight, perhaps 180-200 pounds, but distributed in a way that Robert's understanding of physics couldn't accommodate. He entered the data into his field notebook with precise detail. 0647 hours, 43° bar 24.2 and 110-47, 13.6 W. Track sequence anomaly, requires further documentation. He refused to write what he was thinking. What he was thinking wasn't scientific. The Motorola radio on his belt crackled. Fitzgerald, this is base. What's your status? Marker 4.7, documenting possible evidence, Robert replied. I need the SAR team to hold position until I finish the survey. Copy that. Jenkins is asking about the timeline. Tell Jenkins that proper documentation takes precedence over speed. If we compromise the evidence now, we lose any chance of understanding what happened. He heard the dispatcher sigh. He's not going to like that. He doesn't have to like it. He just has to follow protocol. Robert had worked with Dale Jenkins before. The SAR coordinator was competent but impatient, the kind of man who valued action over analysis. They'd clashed on previous operations, particularly during the Michelle Torres case in 2012. When Robert's insistence on cataloging every piece of evidence had delayed the search by 4 hours. They'd found Torres alive, hypothermic but stable, exactly where Robert's systematic grid search had predicted. Jenkins never apologized. The tracks continued into the forest, weaving between the pines with a purposeful rhythm. Robert followed, photographing every 10 feet, his scientific mind struggling to construct a rational framework for what he was documenting. The logical explanations came first. Hoax, though the remoteness of the location made that unlikely. Multiple animals following the same path, though the continuity of the trail suggested a single entity, some kind of deformity or injury causing irregular locomotion, though that didn't explain the species variation. Or something else. Something the Shoshone guides wouldn't discuss, that the old-timers in Jackson Hole mentioned only in vague terms, that existed in the anthropological record but not in the accepted scientific literature of wildlife biology. Robert stopped that line of thinking immediately. Data didn't lie, but interpretation required discipline. He needed more evidence. The trail led him deeper into the forest, climbing steadily toward the 8,000-foot elevation mark. The soil here was rockier, the tracks less defined, but something else emerged: territorial markings. Trees showed damage at the 7-foot height, bark stripped away in long vertical gouges that exposed the pale wood underneath. The pattern was consistent with large predator behavior: bears marking their range, wolves establishing dominance. But the spacing was wrong. The marks appeared every 50 feet, too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be random. Robert measured one of the gouges with his tape measure, 4 parallel scratches, each approximately 9 inches long, the deepest penetrating 3/4 of an inch into the wood. He examined the edges with his magnifying glass. The cuts were clean, almost surgical, not the ragged tearing a bear's claws would produce. And there was something else. A faint smell that his rational mind struggled to categorize. Decay, certainly, but mixed with something chemical, sharp and wrong for these woods. His satellite phone buzzed. Text message from Jenkins. Team assembled. Need green light to proceed. Conditions deteriorating. Weather moving in from northwest. Robert checked his barometer. The pressure had dropped 0.12 inches in the past hour. The wind had shifted, carrying moisture from the Snake River Plain. They had perhaps 6 hours before the temperature dropped and visibility declined. Standard SAR protocol recommended securing all personnel before conditions became hazardous. But the tracks were fresh. Whatever had made them, whatever biological impossibility had walked through this forest, had done so recently. The soil displacement showed minimal erosion. The exposed wood on the trees hadn't yet begun to oxidize. 12 hours old, perhaps less. He radioed back. Proceeding on primary trail. Evidence suggests recent activity. Maintain safety protocols but prepare for extended operation. We have families asking questions, Fitzgerald. The Dawson sister is demanding updates. Tell her we're following the evidence. Tell her we'll find her brother. He didn't add what he was thinking. Tell her we might not like what we find. The trail climbed higher. Robert's breath came harder in the thinning air, his quadriceps burning as the grade increased. The forest began to change character at this elevation, the lodgepole pines giving way to subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. The understory thinned, leaving exposed granite and loose scree. The tracks remained visible, though now they appeared primarily in patches of soil between the rocks. Still changing. Still impossible. At 8,400 feet, Robert found Tyler Dawson's backpack. It sat in the middle of the trail, propped upright against a boulder, as if placed there deliberately. No signs of struggle, no indication of animal interference. The zippers were closed, the straps unbuckled. Robert photographed it from multiple angles before approaching, documenting the position, the lighting, the surrounding terrain. He pulled on nitrile gloves before touching it. The pack was a standard Osprey model, 65-liter capacity showing normal wear. Robert opened it systematically, cataloging each item as he removed it. Tent, still in stuff sack. Sleeping bag, rated to 15 deg. Camp stove, fuel canister, full. Water filtration system. Food supplies for 3 days, mostly untouched. First aid kit, headlamp, extra batteries, rain shell, insulated jacket. Everything a responsible backpacker would carry. Everything Tyler Dawson would need to survive in this environment. Left behind. No wallet, no phone, no identification. Those items would have been in his pockets on his person, but also missing. The items a hiker in distress would grab first. No water bottles, no emergency whistle, no map or compass, as if he'd simply stood up and walked away, taking only what he carried on his body. leaving everything else arranged for someone to find. Robert examined the pack's exterior pockets. In the top pouch, he found a small spiral-bound notebook, the kind used for field observations. He opened it carefully. Tyler Dawson's handwriting filled the pages, neat, methodical, detailing his trek. Day 1, String Lake TH to Holly Lake, 7.2 miles. Elevation gain 2,180 F-tier. Saw elk herd near Paintbrush Canyon Junction. Weather clear. Camped at designated site HL4. Day 2, Holly Lake to Cascade Canyon via Paintbrush Divide, 8.1 miles. Incredible views from Divide, 10,700 FT. Tough descent. Something weird with the wildlife. No birds singing after noon. Dead silent. Found tracks I can't identify near unnamed creek at approximately 43°45 and 110°48 W. Taking photos. The entry stopped. No day 3. But there was something else. A loose page folded and tucked into the back of the notebook. Robert unfolded it carefully. A hand-drawn map, sketchy but detailed enough. It showed the standard trail system, but someone had added annotations in pencil. Shoshone Sacred Site, Do Not Approach, Old Ranger Station, abandoned 1960s, and, circled multiple times, Seen Here After Dark, Do Not Follow. Below the map, in different handwriting, more erratic, pressed hard into the paper, someone had written a single line in what Robert assumed was Shoshone. Numu Mia Puhagantu. Robert didn't speak Shoshone, but something about those words made his skin contract. He photographed the page, then the entire notebook, then carefully replaced everything in the pack. He needed to get this to base camp, needed linguistic analysis, needed a sound cut through the forest. Not wind, not animal, not anything his 11 years of experience could categorize. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, then climbed in pitch until it became something that made his inner ear ache. A vocalization, but wrong. Human vocal cords couldn't produce that resonance, that sustained note that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Robert's pulse accelerated. He felt it in his carotid artery, counted it automatically. 98 beats per minute, up from his resting rate of 64. Physiological response to perceived threat. Autonomic nervous system activation. His training took over. Note the symptoms, categorize the reaction, maintain objectivity. The sound stopped. The forest absorbed it, swallowed it whole, and left behind a silence that felt deliberate. No wind, no birds, no small mammals rustling in the undergrowth, just emptiness. Robert activated his Motorola. Base, this is Fitzgerald. I've located the missing person's equipment at coordinates 43°4451N, 110°4745 W. Subject not with pack. Requesting immediate backup and... A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Close. Perhaps 20 yards. Robert turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the canister of bear spray on his belt. The forest looked exactly as it had moments before. Dense spruce, granite outcroppings, patches of alpine vegetation. Nothing moved, but something was there. He could feel it watching, could sense its presence the way prey animals sense predators. Some ancient circuit in his brain bypassing rational thought to trigger pure survival instinct. Fitzgerald? You're breaking up, please repeat, the radio hissed with static. Robert looked at the display. 5 bars of signal strength. No reason for interference. He raised the radio to respond, and saw the prints. Fresh tracks, still settling, the soil grains sliding back into the depressions. Human footprints, barefoot, running parallel to his own trail. They hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. He'd photographed this exact stretch of ground when he'd approached the backpack, but now they existed, clear as day, as if something had stepped out of the air itself. Robert's analytical mind rebelled. Impossible. Must have been obscured by shadow, by angle, by some perceptual error on his part. He moved closer, crouched down, examined the prints with his magnifying glass. 5 toes, proper arch, correct pressure distribution for human gait, size 11 or 12, male proportions. But the toes were wrong, too long, the joints hyperextended, as if the foot had been stretched. And between the toes, he had to adjust his magnifying glass, certain he was seeing an optical illusion. Thin membranes of skin, vestigial webbing like some kind of evolutionary throwback. His hand shook. He steadied it, forced his breathing to slow, imposed discipline on his racing thoughts. Document the evidence. Collect the data. Analysis comes later. He photographed the tracks, measured them, noted their position relative to the backpack. Then he stood and scanned the forest, searching for the source. The tracks continued into the trees, heading upslope toward the ridgeline. Robert checked his GPS. That direction led to nothing. No official trails, no designated campsites, just wilderness, and eventually the boundary of the Teton Wilderness area. Tens of thousands of acres where a person could disappear and never be found. Where something could exist and never be documented. "Base, this is Fitzgerald." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I'm pursuing a track sequence heading northeast from the equipment site. Evidence suggests the subject may be experiencing medical distress or disorientation. I need the SAR team to follow my GPS coordinates and maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. Copy that. Fitzgerald, Jenkins wants to know if you have visual confirmation it's Dawson. Negative, but the tracks are human. Or, he stopped. The tracks are recent. I'm proceeding." He followed them. The rational part of his mind listed all the reasons this was a poor decision. Operating alone in remote terrain, weather conditions deteriorating, subject potentially dangerous if experiencing psychological crisis, violation of standard safety protocol. But something deeper than training compelled him forward. 11 years of systematic observation, of cataloging the natural world, of believing that everything could be explained if you just collected enough data. All of it was being challenged by what he'd seen in the past 2 hours. He needed to know what was making these tracks. The forest grew denser as he climbed, the spruce trees pressing close, their branches interlocking overhead to filter the sunlight into green-tinted dimness. The temperature dropped. Robert checked his thermometer. 39 degrees Centigrade, down from 43 degrees just an hour ago. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of coming rain. The tracks led him to a creek, unnamed on his maps, cutting through a small ravine lined with moss-covered boulders. The water ran clear and fast, snow melt from the peaks above. The tracks approached the creek bank, then vanished. Robert studied the ground on both sides, no indication of where they went. The subject would have had to cross. The ravine was too steep to descend in either direction. But the opposite bank showed no prints, no disturbed soil, nothing to indicate passage. He was about to radio base when he noticed the smell. That same chemical scent he'd detected at the tree markings, but stronger now, mixed with something organic and rotting. It came from downstream, from behind a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural alcove. Every instinct screamed at him to call for backup, to wait for the SAR team, to let someone else investigate what lay behind those rocks. But Robert had spent his entire career trusting data over intuition, evidence over emotion. He moved forward. Behind the boulders, he found the camp, or what remained of it. A small tent, partially collapsed, its rain fly shredded, camping equipment scattered across the small clearing, a sleeping bag torn open, down feathers mixing with pine needles, a camp stove overturned, fuel spilled across the granite. And blood. Not splattered like violence, but smeared deliberately across the rocks in patterns that Robert's mind refused to interpret as random. He photographed everything, his hands operating on automatic while his thoughts raced. This wasn't Tyler Dawson's gear. The backpack had been intact, untouched. This belonged to someone else, someone who'd been here longer, someone who'd encountered something that had ended very badly. In the center of the clearing, arranged in a careful circle, were bones, animal bones. Robert identified them automatically. Elk vertebrae, deer ribs, smaller mammals he couldn't immediately classify, but arranged deliberately, placed with intention, forming a pattern that had nothing to do with predation or natural death. and in the middle of the bone circle, standing upright like a monument, was a large piece of driftwood carved with symbols. Robert approached it carefully, his anthropology training surfacing. He recognized some of the markings from his research into indigenous cultures of the region, Shoshone, Northern Paiute, Bannock tribes that had inhabited these mountains for millennia. But these symbols were older, more primitive, the kind of iconography that predated written language. Warnings, perhaps, or invocations. At the base of the carved wood, he found a wallet. Waterlogged, falling apart, but the driver's license inside was still readable. Marcus Chen, Seattle, Washington. Expiration date 2011, 3 years ago. Robert's pulse hammered in his ears. This wasn't about Tyler Dawson anymore. This was something older, something ongoing. How many people had vanished in this section of the park? He tried to recall the statistics, but his analytical mind felt fuzzy, overwhelmed. The official records showed, 4 disappearances in the past decade? 7? All attributed to natural causes or accidents, bodies found or presumed dead in falls or from exposure. But what if they'd been wrong? What if... The sound came again. That impossible vocalization. Closer now, perhaps 50 yards upslope. Robert spun toward it, his bear spray in hand, knowing even as he did that chemical deterrent wouldn't matter against something that defied classification. The trees moved, not wind moved, but deliberately parting. Branches pushed aside by something large moving through the forest with unnatural silence. Robert saw it in glimpses between the trunks, a shape, bipedal, hunched forward in a posture that was almost human, but fundamentally wrong. It moved with fluid grace, stepping over obstacles without breaking stride, its movements suggesting intelligence and purpose. Then it stopped. Robert couldn't see it clearly. The trees and shadows obscured direct observation, but he knew it was watching him, studying him, making calculations about what he represented, whether he was a threat or prey or something else entirely. His radio chose that moment to erupt with static and Dale Jenkins' voice, tinny and urgent. "Fitzgerald, we have a situation. Weather's moving in faster than predicted, temperature dropping to freezing, visibility down to a quarter mile. We need to extract you now or you're spending the night up there." The shape in the forest moved. Closer. Robert could hear it now. Not footsteps, but something sliding, scraping against bark and stone. "Copy," Robert whispered into the radio. Not sure why he was whispering, only knowing that making loud sounds felt dangerous. "Proceeding to extraction point. Need coordinates for nearest helicopter access." "Negative on the helicopter. Wind's too high. You need to descend to marker 4, where the trail widens. We'll meet you there with the full team." The shape was circling now. Robert could track its movement by the way branches shifted, by the soft displacement of sound. It was getting between him and the descent route. "Jenkins, I may have found additional evidence related to previous disappearances. I need..." A sound like laughter cut him off. High-pitched, manic, absolutely human in its cruelty, but impossible in its source. It came from directly in front of him, from the shape in the trees, but human throats couldn't produce that layered effect. That sense of multiple voices speaking simultaneously. Then it spoke. Tyler Dawson's voice, perfect mimicry, the slight Oklahoma accent intact. "Help me, please. It's dark and I can't find the trail and something's following me and..." The voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced immediately by a child's voice, crying, calling for its mother. Then an older man, gruff and angry. Then a woman, screaming. A dozen voices overlapping, all human, all terrified, all impossible. Robert ran. His rational mind shut down, overwhelmed by sensory input it couldn't process. Pure survival instinct took over. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping his face, loose rocks sliding under his boots. His GPS unit bounced against his chest. His radio fell from his belt. None of it mattered. He just ran. Behind him, the thing gave chase. He heard it moving through the forest faster than him, covering ground with an efficiency that mocked his panicked flight. Trees that should have provided obstacles meant nothing to it. The dense undergrowth that slowed his every step barely seemed to exist for it, and it kept calling out, kept mimicking voices, a stream of stolen words from stolen throats. "Wait for me, Robert. Don't leave me here. Please come back. I'm scared. Help me." It knew his name. Robert's boot caught on a root. He went down hard, his momentum carrying him forward into a tumbling roll down a short embankment. He slammed into a tree trunk, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Lay there gasping, trying to orient himself, trying to understand which way was downslope, where the trail was, how far he'd run. Silence. Absolute and suffocating. The thing had stopped chasing, or stopped making noise while it chased. Robert couldn't tell which possibility terrified him more. He forced himself up, inventory checking his body. Bruised ribs, probably cracked, left knee swelling, minor lacerations on his hands and face. Mobile, functional. His training tried to reassert itself, assess, adapt, act, but his hands shook too badly to consult his compass. A branch cracked, directly above him. Robert looked up. Something perched in the spruce tree, clinging to the trunk 20 feet overhead. The angle was wrong to see it clearly. The branches obscured its form, but he caught details. Elongated limbs bent in positions that defied human anatomy. Fingers, if they were fingers, wrapped around the bark with too many joints. And eyes, reflective, catching what little light penetrated the canopy, glowing with a color that Robert's brain struggled to process. It cocked its head, bird-like, studying him. Then it opened its mouth and spoke with his own voice, perfect mimicry. "Document the evidence, collect the data, analysis comes later." His words, from an hour ago, recorded and played back with inhuman precision. Robert did the only thing his fractured rationality could conceive. He pulled out his camera and took a photograph. The flash fired, bright, blinding in the dim forest. The thing in the tree recoiled, dropping from its perch with inhuman speed, landing in a crouch between the trees. Robert got another shot, then another. The flash firing automatically, his finger jamming the shutter button in desperate repetition. It screamed, not with a human voice this time, but something ancient and wrong. A sound that made Robert's bones ache and his vision blur at the edges. Then it moved, not running but flowing like liquid shadow through the trees, its form seeming to blur and shift as it went. Wolf, then human, then something else. The transition so rapid Robert's eyes couldn't track them. And then it was gone. Robert stood there, camera in shaking hands, breathing hard, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. The scientific method demanded replication, verification, peer review. But some part of him knew that what he'd photographed wouldn't appear on the images. Knew that he'd just encountered something that existed outside the framework of his careful, rational world. His scattered thoughts were interrupted by voices. Real voices, human and welcome. The SAR team, calling his name, crashing through the underbrush with their usual lack of subtlety. Robert called back, his voice hoarse, and within minutes, Dale Jenkins emerged from the trees with 4 other team members. "Jesus, Fitzgerald, you look like you went 10 rounds with a grizzly." Jenkins grabbed his arm, steadying him. "What the hell happened?" "Your GPS signal went erratic, your radio cut out." "I found evidence," Robert interrupted. "Multiple disappearances, a camp, Marcus Chen, and..." He trailed off. What could he say? That he'd been chased by something that shouldn't exist? That he'd photographed a creature from Shoshone legends? Jenkins mistook his hesitation for shock. "All right, we're getting you down the mountain. You can brief us at base. Weather's getting nasty, and we're losing daylight." "Tyler Dawson," Robert said. "We haven't found him. We'll expand the search at first light. Right now you're hypothermic and injured, and we're all getting the hell out of here." Robert wanted to argue, wanted to insist they continue, but his body betrayed him. His legs buckled. Jenkins caught him, signaled to the others, and they began the careful descent toward the lower elevations and safety. As they moved down the trail, Robert looked back once. The forest was darkening, shadows lengthening, the temperature plummeting toward freezing. And somewhere in those shadows, something watched them leave. He couldn't see it, couldn't prove it, but he knew with absolute certainty that it was there. Waiting. The next morning, Robert Fitzgerald sat in the ranger station, his ribs taped, his knee elevated, reviewing his photographs on his laptop. The images from the forest showed exactly what he'd expected. Trees, shadows, nothing anomalous. The thing he'd photographed hadn't registered on the digital sensor, or perhaps it had never been there in a way that cameras could capture. But he had other evidence. The notebook from Tyler Dawson's pack, the wallet from Marcus Chen, the GPS coordinates of the camp, the documented track sequence that violated every principle of animal locomotion. All of it sat in evidence bags on his desk, waiting for analysis. Dale Jenkins walked in, coffee in hand, looking exhausted. "Weather's cleared. We're going back up with a full team. Cadaver dogs, technical climbers, the works. If Dawson's up there, we'll find him." "You won't," Robert said quietly. Jenkins frowned. "What? You won't find him? Not alive. Maybe not at all." Robert pulled up the map on his computer, marked the locations where he'd found evidence. "There's a pattern here. Disappearances going back years, all in this section of the park. All in areas that the Shoshone marked as forbidden. And there's something else." He opened the translation file he'd been working on since dawn. The phrase from Tyler Dawson's notebook run through 3 different language databases, Numu Mia Puhagantu. "It's not quite Shoshone," Robert explained. "It's older, from a dialect that died out in the 1800s, but the rough translation is, 'The skinwalker walks here.'" Jenkins set down his coffee. "Come on, Fitzgerald. You're talking about folklore, campfire stories. I'm talking about documented evidence that doesn't fit any known animal behavior. I'm talking about tracks that change species. I'm talking about a creature that can mimic human voices with perfect accuracy." Robert met Jenkins's eyes. "I'm talking about what I saw up there. What you think you saw. You were hypothermic, injured, disoriented. The mind does funny things in those conditions. My mind was functioning perfectly. I documented everything according to protocol, and the data suggests we have a missing person and a traumatized ranger who needs to take some time off." Jenkins softened his tone. "Look, Robert, I'm not dismissing what you experienced, but we deal in facts, not legends. We'll search that area thoroughly. If there's a dangerous animal up there, mountain lion, rogue bear, whatever, we'll find evidence and deal with it appropriately." Robert wanted to argue further, but he recognized the futility. Jenkins operated within a framework that didn't allow for the impossible. And perhaps that was protective. Perhaps that was necessary. Some truths were too dangerous to accept. "Fine," Robert said, "but I'm going back up there with you." "Not with that knee." "I don't care about the knee. I need to show you the camp, the bone circle, all of it." Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you follow my lead and you don't take any unnecessary risks. Clear?" "Clear." The search team assembled at dawn. 12 people, 3 cadaver dogs, full technical gear. They ascended the Cascade Canyon Trail under clear skies, the storm having passed overnight, leaving the forest washed clean and bright. Robert led them to the creek, to the ravine, to the cluster of boulders where he'd found the camp. Except the camp was gone. The clearing behind the boulders was empty. No tent, no scattered equipment, no blood on the rocks. The bone circle had vanished. Even the carved driftwood with its ancient symbols was missing. The ground showed no indication anything had ever been there. No disturbed soil, no scorch marks from the camp stove, nothing. Jenkins turned to Robert. "You're sure this is the location?" Robert checked his GPS. "Exact coordinates, this is it." One of the SAR team members, a younger ranger named Collins, searched the area thoroughly. No sign of recent activity. Ground covers undisturbed. If there was a camp here, it would have left some trace. "It was here," Robert insisted. "The wallet, the equipment, all of it. I photographed." But he hadn't photographed the camp. He'd been interrupted by the sound, by the thing in the trees. He'd documented the tracks, the backpack, but not the camp itself. Jenkins' expression shifted from concern to something like pity. "Robert, I think the altitude and the situation got to you more than you realized. There's no shame in... I know what I saw. I believe you think you saw it, but the evidence was removed, deliberately. Something cleaned this site after I left." The team exchanged glances. Robert could read their thoughts. Hypothermia-induced hallucination. Stress response, the beginning of a mental breakdown. They'd seen it before in rangers who'd spent too much time alone in the backcountry, who'd pushed themselves too hard, who'd encountered trauma and tried to process it through denial and elaboration. They searched for 3 more days, covered every square mile within a 5-kilometer radius of where Tyler Dawson had last been seen. The dogs found nothing. The technical climbers checked every cliff face and crevasse. The helicopters, once the wind died down, surveyed the entire region with thermal imaging. Tyler Dawson had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. On the 4th day, they called off the search. The official report listed him as presumed dead, victim of a fall or exposure. Body likely scattered by scavengers or washed away in the spring snowmelt. A tragic accident in a dangerous environment. It happened every year in national parks across the country. One more name in the sad statistics. Robert filed his own report. Detailed, methodical, full of GPS coordinates and photographic evidence and careful documentation of every anomaly he'd observed. He included the translations of the Shoshone phrases, the historical data on previous disappearances, the scientific impossibility of the track sequences. The report was acknowledged, filed, and quietly buried. His supervisor suggested he take medical leave, see a counselor, get some distance from the incident. They spoke in careful tones, the vocabulary of people dealing with someone they suspected was losing their grip on reality. Maybe they were right. Maybe his rational mind had finally encountered something it couldn't process and had constructed an elaborate delusion to explain the unexplainable. Maybe Tyler Dawson had simply fallen and everything else, the tracks, the voices, the thing in the trees, was trauma-induced hallucination. But on his last day before medical leave, Robert received a package. No return address, postmarked from Jackson Hole. Inside was a photograph, not one of his, but an old Polaroid, faded and cracked with age. It showed a group of people, Shoshone by their features, standing in front of a traditional structure. But one figure in the back was wrong. Its proportions were off, its posture unnatural, and its eyes, even in the degraded image, seemed to catch the light with an unholy reflection. On the back of the photograph, written in a shaking hand, "They've been here longer than us. They'll be here when we're gone. Don't go back to the mountain." Robert stood in his apartment holding the photograph, feeling his carefully constructed worldview crumbling. 11 years of systematic observation, of believing that everything could be quantified and explained, all of it rendered meaningless by what he'd encountered in those mountains. The rational part of his mind still insisted there had to be an explanation. Some undiscovered species, some natural phenomenon misinterpreted, some solution that fit within the framework of accepted science. But late at night, when the rational mind quiets and older instincts emerge, Robert knew the truth. He'd encountered something that existed outside the taxonomy of the natural world. Something that the indigenous peoples had known about for millennia, had learned to fear and respect and avoid. Something that modern science had dismissed as folklore, because accepting its existence would require abandoning too many comfortable certainties. He thought about Tyler Dawson, about Marcus Chen, about the others whose names he'd found in the old records, vanished in that same stretch of wilderness over decades. He thought about the tracks that changed species, the voices that mimicked with perfect cruelty, the eyes that reflected light with inhuman color. And he thought about the warning, written centuries ago by people who understood these mountains better than any park ranger ever could. The skinwalker walks here. Robert carefully filed the photograph with his evidence, added it to his personal records. Then he did something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. He stopped trying to explain it. He simply accepted that some things exist beyond explanation, that the world contains horrors that science cannot classify and reason cannot defeat. 6 months later, Robert Fitzgerald returned to work. He'd been cleared by the counselors, deemed fit for duty. His incident report noted and filed away, he resumed his patrols, his data collection, his meticulous documentation of the natural world. But he never went back to that section of the Cascades Canyon Trail, never ventured above the 8,000-foot elevation in that particular drainage, never investigated reports of strange tracks or missing persons in that region. Some of his colleagues noticed, whispered about it in the break room, speculated about what had really happened during those 3 days. Robert didn't care what they thought. He'd learned something vital up there in the high country, something that trumped scientific curiosity and rational inquiry. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some creatures are better left unobserved. Some places, no matter how beautiful, no matter how well mapped, contain ancient dangers that modern understanding can't explain or modern courage can't face. The forest keeps its secrets. The mountains hold their dead, and somewhere in the high wilderness of Grand Teton, something walks that wears many faces and speaks with many voices, and exists in the space between legend and terrible reality. Robert knows it's still there. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind carries sounds from the high peaks, he hears echoes of that impossible vocalization. Sometimes, reviewing his data, he finds track photographs that shouldn't exist, images he doesn't remember taking, and sometimes, very rarely, he receives anonymous packages, photographs, journal entries, evidence from other rangers in other parks who've encountered something they can't explain. A network of people who've seen what science doesn't acknowledge, who've learned what the old stories tried to teach. He keeps it all in a locked file cabinet in his apartment. Documentation of the undocumented, evidence of the impossible, proof that the rational world has boundaries, and that something waits in the spaces beyond those boundaries. Something patient, something ancient, something that walks on 2 legs and 4, that speaks with stolen voices and watches with inhuman eyes. The Shoshone were right. The Skinwalker walks here, and it always will. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The boot prints changed species between steps. Human, then wolf, then something with claws that left grooves an inch deep in sandstone. William Archer knelt beside the tracks, his Nikon D3200 clicking methodically as he documented each print in the sequence. 23 years with the National Park Service had taught him to trust evidence over instinct, data over gut feelings. But the evidence here violated every principle of biology he'd learned at UC Davis, every tracking course he'd taken, every rational explanation his mind could construct. The prints originated at the trailhead of the Maze District, where Jordan Hayes' rental Jeep sat abandoned 3 days ago. Keys still in the ignition, driver's door hanging open. Standard missing hiker protocol: document the scene, establish a perimeter, call in SAR. Archer had done everything by the book. What the book didn't cover was tracks that transformed mid-stride, or the way Jordan's boot tread suddenly terminated at marker 2.3 and became something else entirely. Archer adjusted his Garmin GPS, N38°0944, W109°5012, elevation 5,847 feet, and continued photographing. The October sun hammered down on the red rock maze, temperature pushing 92 degrees despite the season. He'd consumed half his water already, and the rational part of his brain that calculated hydration needs against distance kept running the same warning. Turn back now. Call this in. Let the experts handle it. But Archer was the expert. 15 years stationed at Canyonlands, 8 of those specializing in the maze, the most remote section of the park, where 30 miles of bad road deterred all but the most dedicated adventurers. He knew every canyon, every pour-over, every hidden spring in this labyrinth of stone. He knew what belonged here and what didn't. These tracks didn't belong anywhere. Hayes! His voice echoed off the canyon walls, distorted by the acoustics into something that sounded like mockery. Jordan Hayes, this is Park Ranger Archer. If you can hear me, stay where you are. The silence that returned felt deliberate, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. Archer had reviewed Jordan's backcountry permit that morning, studying the neat handwriting that detailed a 5-day solo hike through the maze. 26 years old, from Boulder, Colorado. Experienced backpacker, according to the permit. Proper gear list: Osprey pack, MSR tent, water filtration system, first aid kit, emergency beacon. The beacon hadn't been activated. That fact bothered Archer more than the impossible tracks. He followed the prints deeper into the maze, where sandstone walls rose 200 feet on either side, narrowing the sky to a ribbon of blue. The transformation in the tracks continued every 20 or 30 yards. Human, canine, something unclassifiable. Then back to human again. Always heading northwest, toward the confluence of canyons locals called the Devil's Pocket, though that name appeared on no official maps. The Navajo guides who occasionally led permitted tours through this area refused to enter the Devil's Pocket. Archer had always filed that information under cultural superstition, the same category where he mentally stored stories about skinwalkers and shapeshifters that the old-timers sometimes mentioned around campfires. Interesting folklore, nothing more. He was a scientist, a man who believed in evidence and empirical observation. The evidence was making him reconsider. At marker 4-8, Archer found Jordan's Camelback hydration pack, discarded beside the trail like shed skin. The bladder was full, 3 liters of untouched water. No experienced hiker abandoned water in the desert. He photographed it from multiple angles, tagged the location on his GPS, then examined the pack itself. No tears, no blood, no signs of struggle. Jordan had simply removed it and walked away. Except Jordan hadn't walked away. Something wearing Jordan's boots had walked away. Archer's Motorola radio crackled, static but no voice. He was beyond range of the ranger station, which meant he was officially alone in a section of park where rescue, if needed, would take minimum 6 hours. Standard protocol dictated he turn back, mark the GPS coordinates, and return with a full SAR team. He kept walking. The sun was beginning its descent when Archer found the second abandoned item, Jordan's North Face jacket, folded neatly on a flat rock, weighted down by a stone. The temperature would drop 40 degrees after sunset. No one discarded their jacket voluntarily in desert country. He checked the pockets, empty except for a small spiral notebook, the kind hikers used for trail journals. The last entry was dated 3 days ago, the handwriting increasingly erratic. Day 3. Something following me since yesterday. Saw it at dusk. Looked like a coyote at first, but moved wrong. Too fluid, too aware. Tried to photograph it, but camera wouldn't focus, just blur. It calls to me at night. Sounds like my sister, but Sarah's in Denver. Sarah's in Denver. Sarah's in Denver. It knows things it shouldn't know. The entry ended mid-sentence, pen dragging across the page as if Jordan had been interrupted. Archer's hands had started trembling. He noticed this clinically, the way he might note any physiological response to stress. Elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, peripheral vasoconstriction causing cold fingers despite the heat. His body was preparing for fight or flight, pumping adrenaline through his system, but his mind remained stubbornly analytical, trying to construct reasonable explanations for unreasonable data. Heat exhaustion could cause hallucinations. Dehydration could trigger paranoia. Perhaps Jordan had experienced some kind of psychological break, and the tracks had a rational explanation he simply hadn't discovered yet. Maybe erosion patterns, or multiple animals using the same trail, or... The rationalization died when he saw the petroglyph. It was carved into the canyon wall at chest height, fresh cuts in ancient stone, not the 1,000-year-old ancestral Puebloan art that decorated many of these canyons, but new work, crude and desperate. The image showed a human figure surrounded by 4 animal forms: coyote, wolf, bear, raven. Beneath it, scratched in English, "It wears what it kills." Jordan's handwriting. Jordan's warning. Archer photographed the petroglyph with hands that shook badly enough to blur 2 shots. He had to brace his wrist against the rock for the 3rd attempt. The sun was touching the canyon rim now, and shadows were pooling in the low places, thick and premature. He calculated the remaining daylight, 47 minutes until sunset, another 20 minutes of usable twilight after that, an hour and 7 minutes to find Jordan Hayes, or make the decision to turn back. The tracks led into a side canyon he'd never explored, a narrow slot barely wide enough for his shoulders. The walls closed in, stone pressing from both sides, and Archer had to turn sideways to proceed. His pack scraped against rock. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the perpetual shade, and the air smelled wrong. Not the clean mineral scent of sandstone, but something organic and spoiled, like meat left too long in the sun. 20 yards into the slot canyon, the tracks disappeared. Not gradually, not obscured by erosion or sand, simply gone as if Jordan had evaporated mid-step. Archer checked every surface. Walls, ground, even the narrow strip of sky visible overhead. Nothing. He backtracked, confirming he hadn't missed a turnoff. The tracks definitely entered the slot canyon, they definitely didn't exit, unless they'd gone up. Archer tilted his head back, studying the canyon walls. Sandstone, vertical, essentially unclimbable without technical equipment. But 30 feet above him, a narrow ledge ran along the eastern wall, barely 6 inches wide, and on that ledge, caught in a crack in the rock, was a torn strip of orange fabric, the same color as Jordan's pack. No human could have climbed that wall. No human could have squeezed onto that ledge, but something had. The sun vanished behind the canyon rim, and shadows rushed in like floodwater. Archer pulled his maglite from his belt, clicked it on. The beam seemed thin and inadequate against the sudden darkness. His radio crackled again, still static, but underneath it, barely audible, something that might have been breathing. Hayes? His voice sounded small, swallowed by stone. Jordan, if you're up there, I need you to respond. The breathing on the radio stopped. A different sound replaced it. Soft, rhythmic, disturbingly familiar. Footsteps. Not from the radio, but from behind him, back the way he'd come. Footsteps in the slot canyon where no one should be. Archer spun, flashlight beam catching the canyon walls, illuminating nothing but stone and shadow. The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried, coming closer. He pressed himself against the wall, one hand on his radio, the other fumbling for the canister of bear spray on his belt. Park regulations required it, though no grizzlies lived in southern Utah. Right now he was grateful for the pepper spray on steroids, even if he wasn't sure what he intended to use it against. The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, Archer became aware of his own breathing, ragged and too loud. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat stung his eyes despite the canyon's chill. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to leave, to get out of this slot canyon, to call for extraction and let someone else, anyone else, handle this. Then the voice spoke, and it sounded exactly like Jordan Hayes. Ranger Archer? Thank God. I'm hurt. I'm up here on the ledge. I can't get down. The voice came from above, from the direction of the orange fabric. Archer's flashlight beam swept upward, catching nothing but stone in the gathering darkness. Jordan, where are you exactly? I can't see you. Right here. The voice was closer now, no longer from above, from beside him, from inside the stone itself. Right here, William. Archer's stomach lurched. He'd never introduced himself. Jordan's permit had listed him only as Ranger W. Archer. No one in this canyon knew his first name. Who are you? He kept his voice steady through sheer force of will, years of training overriding the primal terror trying to claw its way up his throat. The thing wearing Jordan's voice laughed, a sound like wind through a dead tree, empty and wrong. I'm someone who's been walking these canyons since before your people gave them names, it said. And now the voice was shifting, modulating through different registers. Jordan's voice, then deeper, then something that might have been multiple voices speaking in unison. Someone who knows you, William Archer, knows your patterns, your training, your beautiful, rational mind that explains away everything it doesn't understand. You walked right into my home following my trail like a good student, so methodical, so predictable. The temperature plummeted. Archer's breath emerged in visible clouds. Ice crystals formed on the canyon walls, impossible in October, impossible in Utah, impossible anywhere except in his deteriorating sanity. Show yourself. He raised the bear spray canister, knowing it was useless, needing to do something with his hands. "I already did," the voice said, amused. "You've been looking at me for hours." The shadows moved. Not in the way shadows move when light sources shift. This was autonomous motion, deliberate and predatory. The darkness pooled and rose, taking form in the narrow space between the canyon walls. Archer's mind rejected what his eyes reported. A shape that was humanoid and canine simultaneously, tall enough that it had to hunch in the confined space, with eyes that reflected his flashlight beam in shades of green and gold that belonged to no animal he could name. "Yi Nald Lushi," the thing said, and its mouth stretched too wide when it spoke, revealing teeth that were too many and too sharp. "That's what the Diné call us, the skinwalkers, the ones who walk on all fours. We wear what we kill, William. We take it and use it and become it." Jordan Hayes was so easy, young, alone, convinced of their own competence. They never even screamed, just confusion, then understanding, then nothing at all. Archer's finger found the trigger on the bear spray. His rational mind, fragmenting under the weight of impossibility, managed one clear thought: spray and run. He pressed the trigger. The stream of capsaicin hit the creature square in what might have been its face. It didn't flinch. The spray passed through it as if through smoke, spattering uselessly against the canyon wall. The thing that wore Jordan's voice laughed again. "You can't hurt smoke and shadow with your chemicals, Ranger. You can't GPS your way out of this. You can't apply logic to something that exists in the spaces between your precious empirical observations." It moved closer, and Archer could smell it now. Decay and sage, copper and stone dust. The scent of ancient places disturbed, but I appreciate the attempt. So very human. So very William Archer, always trying to solve problems with tools and training. Archer dropped the useless canister and ran. The slot canyon seemed longer than before, the walls closer, the darkness thicker. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he fled, illuminating fragments of nightmare. The walls breathing, the ground rippling like water, shadows with too many legs skittering across stone. Behind him the creature followed, and it sounded like a whole pack now, padding footsteps and clicking claws and something heavy dragging across rock. He burst from the slot canyon into the main drainage, lungs burning, legs screaming. The last traces of twilight remained, enough to see by, enough to run by. He grabbed his radio, pressed transmit with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Archer, badge 847, requesting immediate extraction from the Maze District. Coordinates..." Static swallowed his words. The radio died mid-transmission, LCD screen going dark, despite fresh batteries installed that morning. Of course it did. The creature emerged from the slot canyon, and in the fading light, Archer finally saw it clearly. It wore Jordan Hayes the way someone might wear a poorly fitted coat. Jordan's features stretched over something larger. Jordan's movements replicated with slight delays, as if the thing inside was still learning how to operate human muscles. But the eyes were wrong. Too bright, too aware, filled with an intelligence that predated language. "You're trying to understand this," it said with Jordan's mouth. "I can see it in your face. Your mind is cataloging symptoms, looking for explanations. Heat stroke, hallucination, ergot poisoning from contaminated water. Anything but the simple truth." "What truth?" Archer backed away, hands empty, mind racing through useless survival strategies. "That your science is incomplete, that your maps have holes. That something older than your civilization lives in those holes, and sometimes, when someone wanders too far into our territory, when someone ignores the warnings written in stone and story, we claim what we're owed." The creature took a step forward, and Archer saw its shadow on the canyon wall. Not human, not animal, but something that shifted between forms with each movement. "Jordan Hayes paid the price for trespassing. Now you will too." "I'm not trespassing. I'm conducting a search and rescue operation. I'm doing my job." "Your job." The thing laughed, and the sound echoed off a dozen canyon walls, multiplying until it seemed like the entire maze was laughing at him. "You think your job gives you authority here? You think your badge and your uniform mean anything to me? I was here when the ancestral Puebloans carved their homes in these cliffs. I was here when they left, fleeing the drought and the darkness. I was here when your people arrived and claimed ownership of stone that will outlast your entire species. Your job is nothing. Your authority is nothing. You are nothing but meat that walks and talks and dies. The creature lunged. Archer threw himself sideways, rolling across sandstone that scraped his skin through his uniform. Claws, actual claws, raked the air where he'd been standing, striking sparks against rock. He scrambled to his feet and ran again, no destination in mind now. Just pure animal panic overriding 23 years of training. The canyon became a blur of red stone and purple shadow. Archer's boots pounded against sand and rock, his pack bouncing painfully against his shoulders. Behind him, the creature pursued, but it wasn't hurrying. It knew this maze better than he did. It knew every dead end, every box canyon, every place where the walls narrowed into impassable slots. It was hurting him, and the rational part of his mind, that stubborn, analytical piece that refused to shut down even now, understood this with perfect clarity. He was going to die here. The evidence supported that conclusion. The data was unambiguous, but data could be wrong. Variables could change. New information could alter outcomes. Archer's hand found the emergency beacon on his pack harness. Personal locator beacon, 406 MHz, satellite uplink, guaranteed worldwide coverage. He'd never activated it in 15 years, had always considered it a tool for tourists and amateurs, not for someone who knew the park as well as he did. He pressed the button. The device beeped once, confirming activation. A red LED began flashing. Signal transmitted. Search and rescue would receive the coordinates within minutes. They'd mobilize immediately. 6 hours for the ground team. Maybe less if they could get a helicopter in, though flying the maze at night was nearly impossible. 6 hours. He had to survive 6 hours. The creature roared, a sound that was part human scream, part animal howl, part something that had no analog in nature. It erupted from the shadows, and this time it had dropped any pretense of humanity. What came at Archer was pure nightmare, a mass of fur and flesh and bone that couldn't decide on a single form, that rippled and changed with each stride, that was coyote and bear, and something ancient and wrong all at once. Archer ran toward the only shelter he could see, a collapsed overhang that formed a shallow cave, barely 6 feet deep, but with an opening too narrow for something large to enter quickly. He dove inside, wedged himself into the back, grabbed the largest rock he could find. Not a weapon. He understood now that conventional weapons were useless, but something to hold, something solid and real to anchor himself to the physical world while his mind threatened to fragment completely. The creature stopped at the cave entrance. In the darkness, its eyes glowed like coals, and Archer realized with a fresh wave of horror that there were too many of them. Dozens of eyes, scattered across a body that had too many angles, too many joints, too many pieces of different animals stitched together by some malevolent force. "You've called for help," it said. And now it sounded like multiple Jordans speaking in overlapping phrases. "Interesting choice. Tactical. The beacon will bring more of your kind into my territory. More meat, more skins to wear. Is that what you want, William? To trade your life for theirs?" "They won't come alone," Archer said, surprised that his voice still worked. "They'll come armed, prepared. They'll come with spotlights and cameras and I'll wear their skins too," the creature interrupted. "I'll be the ranger who greets them at the trailhead. I'll lead them deeper into the maze one by one, and I'll take them all. You've given me a gift, William Archer. You've given me a feast." The thing was right. Archer's rational mind, still functioning through the terror, ran the calculations. SAR protocol, team of 4 minimum, likely 6 for a maze extraction. His co-workers, people he'd trained with, eaten with, people with families and futures. He'd just signed their death warrants, unless he could stop this. Unless the rational, methodical, by-the-book ranger could find a solution that his training hadn't prepared him for. Archer's mind raced through Jordan's journal entry. It calls to me at night. Sounds like my sister, but Sarah's in Denver. The creature could mimic voices. It could wear appearances. But there were limits. It had needed to physically consume Jordan to fully replicate their form. It was constrained by something, some rule or law or fundamental principle. Everything had rules, even this. The Navajo have protections against you, Archer said, thinking aloud, trying to piece together fragments of folklore he'd dismissed as superstition. Ceremonies, traditions. The Navajo know better than to speak of us, the creature hissed. They know that to name us is to invite our attention. But yes, they have their pathetic barriers. Ash, tobacco, turquoise, prayers in a language I taught their ancestors to fear. Its eyes multiplied, dozens becoming hundreds, filling the cave entrance with green-gold light. None of which you possess. You have your GPS and your radio and your empirical methodology. How will your science save you, William? It wouldn't. Archer understood that with crystalline clarity. But science was observation, hypothesis, testing. And he'd observed something important. The creature had followed him into the slot canyon, but it had waited at the entrance. It had pursued him through the main drainage, but always from behind, never cutting him off despite clearly knowing the terrain better. It had stopped at the cave entrance rather than simply reaching in and dragging him out. Thresholds. The creature observed thresholds. You can't enter without permission, Archer said, testing the hypothesis. Can you? That's why Jordan folded their jacket and placed it neatly. That's why the hydration pack was set aside, not torn off. You needed them to surrender their belongings, to give up their claim. The creature's eyes dimmed fractionally. Confirmation, though it didn't speak. And this cave, Archer continued, confidence growing as the pattern emerged. It's shelter. Even temporary shelter creates a boundary. You can wait me out, but you can't cross the threshold uninvited. Clever, the thing admitted, and for the first time, it sounded genuinely impressed. The analytical mind finds the pattern. Yes, William Archer, I am bound by certain courtesies, old laws, older than your species, older than the mountains. I cannot take what isn't freely given, cannot cross thresholds without invitation, cannot harm those who remain on consecrated ground. It smiled with Jordan's mouth, a grotesque parody of human expression. But you cannot stay in that cave forever. Eventually, you'll have to leave. Eventually, you'll be thirsty enough or desperate enough or simply exhausted enough to make a mistake. And when you do, I'll be waiting. My team will arrive first. Will they? 6 hours, you said. I heard you calculating. But that assumes optimal response time, assumes no equipment failures, no weather complications, no unfortunate accidents during the rescue attempt. So many variables, William. So many opportunities for delay. The creature settled into a sitting position, its form stabilizing into something almost human. Jordan Hayes, intact and whole, as if the last 3 days had never happened. I'm patient. I've waited decades for the right meal. I can wait 6 more hours. Archer's water was running low. He'd consumed most of his supply during the hike, and the remainder wouldn't last 6 hours in the cave's dry air. Dehydration would set in within 3 or 4 hours, impair his judgment, slow his reflexes. The creature was right. Time was on its side. But Archer had one advantage. His mind, the same analytical instrument that had led him into this trap, could potentially think him out of it. He reviewed everything he'd learned, everything he'd observed, building a cognitive map of the creature's limitations. 1. Required permission or surrender to claim victims. 2. Could not cross thresholds uninvited. 3. Could mimic voices and appearances, but needed physical contact with victim. 4. Bound by old laws that predated human civilization. The 4th point was crucial. Laws implied structure, system, logic. Even supernatural entities operated within frameworks. The question was, what were the rules, and could they be exploited? Tell me, Archer said, buying time. Why reveal yourself? You had me fooled. I followed your trail believing it was Jordan's. You could have taken me any time. Why the conversation? Why the explanations? The creature cocked its head, Jordan's head, in a gesture that was pure predator studying prey. Because meat that understands its fate tastes better. Fear is a spice, William. Knowing is a marinade. I want you to comprehend exactly what you've stumbled into, exactly how powerless your science makes you against something like me. I want you to feel the full weight of your insignificance before I wear your skin. That's not the reason, Archer said, the hypothesis forming as he spoke. You're buying time too. You're waiting for something. For the full dark, maybe? Does your power change with the light? The creature's smile faltered. That's it, isn't it? You're strongest in darkness when shadows have substance, but right now there's still ambient light. Still enough photons bouncing around for eyes to see by, for cameras to capture, for empirical observation to function. Archer checked his watch. 7:47 p.m. Civil twilight ended at 8:03, 16 minutes. 16 minutes until you're at full strength. Clever enough to understand, not clever enough to escape, the creature said. What will you do with your 16 minutes, Ranger? Pray, bargain? I've heard it all before from 100 different victims in 100 different languages. They all say the same things in the end. Archer didn't answer. He was busy conducting an inventory of his remaining gear, performing a systematic assessment. Flashlight, LED, 200 lumens, battery at 70%, emergency whistle, standard issue, first aid kit, various supplies, mostly useless, pocket knife, Victorinox, 3-inch blade, waterproof matches, half a box, emergency blanket, Mylar, reflective, water, approximately 12 ounces remaining, bear spray, empty, discarded, radio, dead, GPS, functioning, coordinates logged, camera, functioning, memory, card at 60% capacity, nothing that qualified as a weapon, nothing blessed or consecrated, nothing from the list of traditional protections against skinwalkers that he vaguely remembered from cultural sensitivity training he'd half listened to 5 years ago. Except, Archer pulled out the emergency blanket. Mylar, aluminum-coated polyethylene, designed to reflect infrared radiation and retain body heat. More importantly, reflective. Mirrors were protection against supernatural entities in multiple folkloric traditions. Vampires, demons, shapeshifters, all supposedly repelled by their own reflections. It was a weak hypothesis, based on cultural tropes rather than specific knowledge of Navajo beliefs. But weak hypotheses were better than no hypotheses. I'm going to walk out of this cave, Archer said, unfolding the blanket with hands that had stopped shaking. I'm going to walk past you, and you're not going to stop me. The creature laughed. Bold, futile, but bold. Come then, let's end this. Archer wrapped the blanket around himself like a cloak, reflective side out. The Mylar crinkled and flashed in the dim light, turning him into a mobile mirror. He gripped his knife in one hand, useless as a weapon but comforting nonetheless, and stepped toward the cave entrance. The creature rose to meet him, Jordan's form melting back into the nightmare amalgam of animal parts and shadow. It filled the cave mouth, blocking the exit, eyes multiplying across its surface like pustules. Reflection won't save you, it hissed. I have no soul to see, no true form to reveal. I am nothing and everything, and mirrors show only emptiness. But it didn't attack, didn't reach out to grab him. It swayed backward fractionally as Archer advanced, the Mylar blanket flashing and shimmering. Not a repulsion, Archer realized. Confusion. The creature hunted by sight and scent and sound, but the blanket disrupted all three, visually fracturing his outline, trapping his heat signature, muffling his movements in crinkles and rustles that made it harder to pinpoint his exact location. It wasn't supernatural protection. It was sensory camouflage. Good enough. Archer pushed forward, holding the blanket wide, creating a mobile screen between himself and the creature. He could hear it hissing and snarling, could feel the displacement of air as it moved, but it wasn't touching him. The old laws held it needed invitation, needed permission, needed some act of surrender before it could claim him. He burst from the cave into the canyon, wrapped in his ridiculous mylar cloak, and ran. The creature roared and gave chase, but now Archer had a destination in mind. Not escape. He understood there was no escaping something that knew these canyons better than he did. But he didn't need to escape. He needed to survive 6 hours. And there was one place in the maze that might offer protection. The Harvest Scene Pictograph, 3 miles northeast. Ancient ancestral Pueblo and rock art, one of the best preserved panels in the park, protected under multiple federal and tribal agreements. Consecrated ground, in a sense. Sacred space, observed and honored by every culture that had passed through this region for centuries. If thresholds mattered, if old laws held power, then maybe, just maybe, a place that old and that sacred would constitute a boundary the creature couldn't cross. 3 miles. Archer was in decent shape, could maintain a 7-minute mile pace on flat ground. But this wasn't flat ground. This was canyon country, full of obstacles and elevation changes and uncertain footing in near darkness. 25 minutes, optimistically. 30 minutes more likely. He had 11 minutes until full dark. Archer pushed harder, mylar blanket flapping behind him like broken wings, flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead. The creature followed, sometimes close enough that he could hear its breathing, sometimes far enough that he thought he might have lost it. But it was always there, pacing him, hurting him, playing with its food. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. The rational part of his mind noted the physiological distress. Lactic acid building, aerobic threshold exceeded, increasing risk of cardiac event. The irrational part, the part that had learned to accept the supernatural in the last 90 minutes, told the rational part to shut up and keep running. The pictograph site appeared as a dark alcove in the canyon wall, protected by a natural overhang. Archer could barely make out the painted figures in the dying light. Human forms harvesting corn, accompanied by geometric symbols and handprints in red and white pigment. The alcove was maybe 15 feet deep, 20 feet wide, with a sand floor disturbed only by wind and occasional maintenance crews. Archer staggered into the space, dropped the mylar blanket, and collapsed against the back wall. His watch read 8:04 p.m. Civil twilight had ended. Full dark had arrived. The creature emerged from the canyon shadows, and now it was truly in its element. It seemed larger in the darkness, more solid, more real. Shadow given weight and purpose. It approached the alcove slowly, savoring the moment. Then it stopped at the threshold, as if it had struck an invisible barrier. "Clever," it said again, and this time there was genuine frustration in its voice. "Very clever, William Archer. You found sanctuary in a painted cave, but paintings fade, protection weakens, and I am so very patient." "My team will be here in 5 hours," Archer gasped, still catching his breath. "You can't wait that long. The helicopters will have spotlights, will fill the canyon with light. Your element will be gone. Perhaps, or perhaps I'll introduce myself as Jordan Hayes, found alive and well, and lead your team on a merry chase through the canyons. So many opportunities for accidents in the dark, William. So many ways for people to become separated from the group." The creature settled into a sitting position again, this time staying carefully outside the alcove. "But you raise a good point. I should probably prepare. Should probably decide which one of you I'll wear when the others arrive. Decisions. It vanished into the darkness there and then gone, and Archer was alone with the ancient paintings and his hammering heart. He activated his flashlight, checked his water, 6 ounces remaining, and tried to assess his situation logically. The pictograph site provided temporary protection, but the creature was right about the team. If it could mimic Jordan Hayes well enough to fool SR, it could lead them into a massacre. He needed to warn them somehow, needed to communicate the nature of the threat. His radio was dead, drained by something that wasn't electrical failure. His phone had never worked this deep in the park. The PLB was one-way communication only. It transmitted coordinates, not messages. But he had his camera. Archer pulled out the Nikon, reviewed the photos he'd taken throughout the day, the impossible tracks, the abandoned gear, Jordan's desperate pictograph warning, the creature itself, or at least blurred images that might convince someone something unusual was happening. He switched the camera to video mode and began recording. This is Ranger William Archer, badge 847, October 17, 2014, approximately 8:15 p.m. I've activated my PLB at coordinates N38°0944, W109D5012. I am currently sheltering at the Harvest Scene pictograph site. He kept his voice steady, professional, despite everything. Be advised that Jordan Hayes is deceased, taken by what I can only describe as a predatory entity indigenous to this region. Navajo tradition identifies it as a skinwalker, a Yi Naldlushi. It has the ability to mimic human appearance and voice. I repeat, it can mimic human appearance and voice. He paused, knowing how insane this sounded, knowing his career was probably over regardless of whether he survived. When SAR arrives, implement the following protocol. No one approaches alone. Establish visual contact with all team members at all times. Use verification phrases known only to park staff. The entity cannot cross thresholds without invitation and is weakened by light. It observes what it calls old laws, but is actively hostile and extremely dangerous. If anyone claims to be Jordan Hayes, consider them hostile until proven otherwise. If anyone claims to be William Archer, he swallowed hard. Consider them hostile until proven otherwise. He stopped recording, ejected the memory card, and sealed it in a waterproof bag from his first aid kit. If he didn't survive, at least there would be evidence. Some record of what happened here. Some warning for the next person who wandered too far into the maze. The hours crawled past. Archer rationed his water, sipping tiny amounts every 30 minutes. He kept his flashlight on, sweeping it across the alcove entrance periodically, though he saw nothing in the darkness beyond. The creature was out there. He could feel it watching, waiting, patient as stone, but it didn't show itself again. At 10:47 p.m., Archer's flashlight began to dim. Battery dying. Despite being fresh that morning, he switched it off to conserve power, plunging himself into absolute darkness broken only by stars visible through the canyon opening. In the dark, the pictographs seemed to glow faintly, paint charged by centuries of sunlight releasing stored luminescence. Or maybe it was just his exhausted mind creating patterns in nothing. Hard to trust perception when reality itself had become negotiable. At 11:33 p.m., Archer heard voices in the canyon. Human voices, calling his name. Relief flooded through him. SAR had made better time than expected. Maybe got a helicopter in somehow, maybe. William, it's Jordan. I escaped. I'm okay. Can you hear me? Archer's relief curdled into fresh horror. The creature, using Jordan's voice, trying to lure him from sanctuary. William, please, I'm hurt. I need help. He pressed his hands over his ears, refusing to listen, refusing to respond. The voice continued. Sometimes Jordan's, sometimes his supervisors, sometimes his ex-wife's, pulling names and relationships from some repository of stolen knowledge. Each voice was perfect, indistinguishable from the real person, and each one begged him to come out to help, to just take a few steps into the darkness. He didn't move. At 1:52 a.m., the real SAR team arrived. Archer heard them before he saw them. Multiple voices, coordinated and professional, calling his name and Jordan's in the standard grid pattern. Helicopter rotors somewhere overhead, spotlights sweeping the canyons. Here, Archer shouted. Pictograph site, but verify before approaching. The voices stopped. A long pause, then. Ranger Archer, this is Tom Griffin, SAR coordinator. Can you verify your badge number? 847, date of hire, March 2003. My supervisor is Denise Park. Your daughter is named Rebecca. Another pause, shorter. Good enough. Are you injured? Are you alone? Uninjured, alone. But there's a hostile entity in the area that can mimic human appearance. Implement verification protocol on all contacts. He could imagine the looks they were exchanging, the assumption that he'd suffered heat stroke or psychological break. But Tom Griffin was a good coordinator, cautious, and he followed the protocol regardless of his doubts. Copy that. Stay where you are. We're coming to you with lights, multiple personnel. If anyone approaches without identifying themselves, do not engage. The SAR team materialized from the darkness. 4 Rangers in full gear, LED arrays blazing, moving in a tight formation that left no blind spots. Tom Griffin was in front, and his face was professionally neutral in the way that told Archer he'd officially become a problem to be managed rather than a colleague to be trusted. Ranger Archer, let's get you out of here. Archer held up the memory card. Everything's documented, the tracks, the evidence, the entity. Review it before you dismiss this as heat stroke. We'll review everything, Tom said carefully. But right now, we need to extract you and continue searching for Jordan Hayes. Can you walk? Could he? Archer stood, legs shaking but functional, and stepped to the alcove entrance. The SAR team's lights illuminated the canyon in harsh LED white, banishing shadows, creating an island of visibility in the darkness. No sign of the creature. Nothing but stone and sand, and 4 worried faces watching him. Archer took a breath and crossed the threshold. Nothing happened. No attack, no ambush. Just the cool night air and the familiar weight of his pack and the concerned hand Tom Griffin placed on his shoulder. Let's go home, Will. They walked through the canyons with lights blazing, helicopter spotlight tracking their progress from above. Archer stayed in the center of the formation, hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound, every flicker at the edge of perception. But the creature didn't show itself. Maybe the lights deterred it. Maybe the presence of multiple people broke whatever rules governed its hunting. Or maybe it was simply satisfied, having claimed Jordan Hayes, content to wait for the next solitary hiker to wander into its territory. At 3:17 a.m. they reached the trailhead. An ambulance waited, along with Denise Park and 2 other senior rangers. Archer submitted to the medical evaluation, mild dehydration, exhaustion, elevated stress markers, nothing serious, and declined transport to the hospital. He insisted on reviewing the memory card with Denise immediately, needed her to see the evidence before official reports and incident reviews diluted everything into bureaucratic ambiguity. They sat in the ranger station, Archer's photos displaying on a computer monitor, the impossible tracks, the abandoned gear, Jordan's warning carved in stone, and the creature itself, blurred in most shots but clearly visible in 3 frames, something that was and wasn't human, that defied casual explanation. Denise studied the images for a long time. Finally, these could be doctored, could be camera malfunctions, light anomalies, misidentified wildlife. Could be, Archer agreed, but they're not. Jordan Hayes is still missing. Search will continue at first light. You won't find them, not alive. Denise closed the laptop. Write your report. Include everything, no matter how unlikely it sounds, but William, this stays between us until we have more data. If word gets out that one of our rangers is claiming supernatural entities in the park. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Archer understood. Evidence without context was just data points. Data points without corroboration were just anomalies. He'd spent 23 years building credibility through logic and methodology, and he'd consumed it all in one night, chasing something that shouldn't exist through canyons that held older laws than his empiricism could accommodate. He filed his report, detailed, technical, factual, included the photographs and video testimony, recommended indefinite closure of the Maze District pending investigation, expected nothing to come of it. 3 days later, SAR found Jordan Hayes' remains, or what was left of them, scattered across 2 miles of canyon floor. The official cause of death was listed as animal predation, species undetermined. The unofficial consensus among the search team was that no known animal could have caused that particular pattern of damage. The case stayed open, unsolved. Archer returned to work after mandatory psych evaluation and 2 weeks leave. He passed the evaluation, learned quickly that describing things in terms of potential psychological stressors and environmental factors, rather than supernatural entities, made everyone more comfortable. He kept his badge, kept his job, but something had shifted. His colleagues looked at him differently now. Not quite skeptical, not quite believing, but aware that William Archer, logical, methodical, by-the-book Archer, had encountered something in the maze that broke him just enough to let the impossible in. He never entered the maze district again. Requested reassignment to the island in the sky section, where trails were wide and well-traveled, where hikers stayed in groups, where nothing ancient and hungry watched from the shadows. But sometimes, on quiet nights when he was closing up the visitor center, he'd see boot prints in the dust outside. Prints that changed species mid-stride, that appeared overnight despite locked doors and security cameras. And he'd know it was out there still, walking the old paths, wearing what it killed, waiting patient as stone for the next person who ignored the warnings and wandered too far into its territory. The Navajo had always known. Their refusal to speak of the Yinaldlushi wasn't superstition. It was survival strategy refined across centuries. Don't name it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't give it invitation through attention. William Archer had learned that lesson the hard way, had paid for his empiricism with Jordan Hayes' life and his own fractured certainty, had discovered that some territories didn't belong to the National Park Service, had never belonged to any human authority, and never would. The maps were wrong. They'd always been wrong. They showed the maze as empty federal land, quantified and measured and managed. They didn't show the spaces between the canyons, the thresholds where old laws still held power, the places where things that wore stolen skins waited in the darkness. William Archer knew better now. He'd updated his internal map, added notations that would never appear in any official document. Here there be monsters, true ones, the kind that can't be photographed clearly or cataloged completely or explained away with comfortable rationality. He kept the memory card in his desk drawer, insurance against forgetting, against the temptation to reframe everything as heat-induced hallucination. On difficult days, he'd pull it out and review the images, forcing himself to remember the impossible tracks, the abandoned gear, the thing that wore Jordan Hayes' face and spoke with multiple voices. Evidence. Empirical observation. Data that contradicted every principle he'd built his career on, but data nonetheless. Sometimes evidence demanded that you expand your model of reality, even when expansion led to places that denied rational explanation. Sometimes being a good scientist meant acknowledging that your instruments were inadequate, your framework incomplete, your understanding tragically limited. William Archer had been a good scientist. Still was, in his way. He'd observed, documented, survived, and learned. The lesson was simple, terrible, and true. The wilderness was bigger than anyone imagined, deeper than any map could show, and in its furthest reaches, older rules than human law still governed who lived, and who became just another cautionary tale whispered around campfires by people who knew better than to wander too far into the maze. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Luis Ramirez had been staring at the timeline for 3 hours when he realized all 7 disappearances happened during the dark moon. The pattern emerged from the chaos of incident reports spread across his desk in the ranger station like accusatory evidence. Coffee had gone cold in his mug somewhere around midnight, but Luis didn't notice. His eyes moved between the dates, cross-referencing them with the lunar calendar he'd pulled from the National Weather Service archives. October 2001, March 2003, January 2004, September 2005. Each disappearance aligned perfectly with the new moon phase, that narrow window when the night sky offered no illumination beyond the cold scatter of stars. Connor Burke's file sat at the top of the stack, missing for 72 hours now. 26 years old, experienced backpacker, carried a Garmin E-Trex GPS unit, a Motorola Talkabout radio, and enough survival gear to last a week in the backcountry. His planned route through the Needles district should have taken 4 days. He'd checked in at the visitor center, paid his overnight permit fee, and walked into Canyonlands National Park with the confidence of someone who'd done this a dozen times before. Luis had found that confidence misplaced in his 7 years as a ranger here. The canyon country of southeastern Utah didn't forgive assumptions. The landscape consumed the unprepared with methodical efficiency. Dehydration, heat stroke, falls from crumbling sandstone ledges, flash floods that turned dry washes into churning death traps in minutes. But those deaths left bodies, evidence, logical conclusions that Luis could document in incident reports and explain to grieving families with the careful detachment his psychology degree had taught him. These 7 disappearances left nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no logical conclusions. The phone on his desk rang, shattering the silence. Luis grabbed it before the second ring. Ramirez. It's Karen. His supervisor's voice carried the flat exhaustion of someone who'd been awake too long. Say our team is heading out at first light. They want your analysis on the probability zones. Luis glanced at the topographic map of the Needles district pinned to his wall, the area where Connor Burke's GPS last registered a ping before going dark. The coordinates put him near the confluence of Elephant Canyon and Devil's Pocket. But Karen, I need to show you something. The pattern I've been... Luis. She cut him off with the tone of someone who'd heard his theories before. We've discussed this. 7 missing persons over 6 years in a park that sees 60,000 visitors annually doesn't constitute a pattern. It's statistics. People get lost. They make bad decisions. We find most of them, and the ones we don't. She trailed off, but Luis knew what she meant. The ones they didn't find had fallen into one of the thousands of slot canyons that spiderwebbed through this terrain, places so narrow and deep that a body might never see sunlight again. All 7 during the new moon, Luis said. All 7 experienced hikers. All 7 carrying proper equipment and emergency beacons. Connor Burke had a spot satellite messenger. It transmitted his location every 10 minutes until 9:47 p.m. 3 nights ago. Then nothing. Complete silence. That's not someone falling into a canyon. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Luis thought the call had dropped. Then Karen sighed. Get some sleep. You're on the SAR briefing at 0600. Bring your probability analysis, not your lunar charts. The line went dead. Luis set the phone down and returned his attention to the files. He'd been with the National Park Service long enough to know when he was being managed, when his supervisors viewed his analytical approach as overthinking rather than thoroughness. They preferred rangers who followed protocol, who searched the statistically likely areas and filed the appropriate paperwork when searches turned up nothing. They didn't want rangers who noticed patterns that suggested something beyond misadventure. But Luis had built his career on noticing what others missed. Before joining the NPS, he'd worked as a data analyst for the Albuquerque Police Department, identifying crime patterns and predicting hotspots. He'd been good at it, good enough that the department had tried to keep him when he'd applied for the ranger position. But Luis had grown up in New Mexico, had spent childhood summers exploring the desert with his grandfather, and the pull of the backcountry had proven stronger than the salary and benefits of police work. His grandfather would have understood these disappearances. Eduardo Ramirez had been full of stories about the wilderness, about things that lived in the desert places where people rarely ventured. Luis had dismissed most of them as folklore, the kind of tales every culture developed to explain the unexplainable. But his grandfather had been serious when he'd given Luis advice before his first ranger posting. Respect the land, respect the night, and never assume you're alone just because you can't see anyone else. Luis pulled another file from the stack. Michael Torres disappeared April 2002. The incident report noted that Torres had been an experienced caver, part of a group exploring some of the unmapped passages in the park's cave systems. He'd separated from his group to photograph a formation, and when they'd come back for him 20 minutes later, he was gone. His camera was found on the cave floor, still on, memory card full of photos. The last image showed the cave wall. Nothing unusual. No one lurking in the shadows. Just rock. But when Luis had obtained copies of all the photos, he'd noticed something the original investigators had missed. In 17 consecutive shots, the cave wall looked normal. In the 18th shot, there was a handprint. Not a human handprint. The proportions were wrong. The fingers too long. The spacing unnatural. By the 19th shot, The print was gone. As if something had pressed against the rock and then pulled away in the seconds between shutter clicks. Luis had shared this observation with Karen 6 months ago. She'd looked at the photos, acknowledged the anomaly, and suggested that another caver might have touched the wall between Torres's shots. When Luis pointed out that Torres had been photographing alone, that his group was 50 yards away, Karen had simply closed the file and changed the subject. The desk lamp flickered. Luis glanced up, noticed the time on the wall clock. 2:17 a.m. The station should have been empty except for him. The overnight dispatcher worked from the main building half a mile away, yet Luis felt the distinct sensation of being watched. The primitive awareness that his psychology training told him was just evolved threat detection. His brain finding patterns in random sensory input. He stood, stretched his back, and walked to the window. The station sat on a small rise overlooking the visitor center parking lot and, beyond that, the vast darkness of the Needles district. No moon tonight. No ambient light from nearby towns. The closest real civilization was Moab, 50 miles north. Just the depth of desert darkness that most people never experienced. The kind that pressed against windows and made the glass feel thinner than it should. Something moved in the parking lot. Luis's hand found the mag light on his desk without conscious thought. He clicked it on and aimed the beam through the window. The lot was empty except for his truck and Karen's SUV. The light caught the reflective surface of a road sign, glinted off the visitor center windows but revealed nothing that might have moved. He killed the light and stood in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust. The human eye could perceive remarkable detail in low light given time and patience. Luis had learned to trust his night vision during backcountry patrols, had developed the skill of seeing without announcing his presence with a flashlight. There, near the trailhead for the Cave Springs Trail. A shape that didn't match the landscape, too tall to be a rock formation, too still to be vegetation moving in the wind. Luis watched it for 30 seconds, counting his breaths, applying the observational techniques his training had emphasized. The shape didn't move. After a full minute, his rational mind provided an explanation, probably a trail sign, or a boulder that looked different in the darkness, made strange by shadows and his own fatigue. Then it turned its head toward the window, toward him. Luis stepped back from the glass involuntarily, his heel catching the chair leg. He stumbled, caught himself on the desk. When he looked back at the window, the shape was gone. Just empty darkness and the familiar silhouettes of the parking lot landscape. His heart was hammering. Luis forced himself to breathe slowly, to apply logic to the moment. Sleep deprivation, stress, the power of suggestion after hours of reading about disappearances. His mind had constructed something from nothing, had interpreted shadows as substance. It happened to everyone who spent too much time alone in remote places. The brain sought patterns, and failing to find them, created them. But his hands were shaking as he gathered the files and locked them in his desk drawer. The SAR briefing was in less than 4 hours. He needed sleep, needed to approach tomorrow's search with a clear head and professional detachment. He needed to stop seeing phantoms in parking lots and patterns in unrelated disappearances. Luis grabbed his jacket and keys, shut off the desk lamp, and headed for the door. The hallway lights had motion sensors. They flickered on as he walked, creating a bubble of illumination that moved with him. His footsteps echoed off the concrete floor. The building felt larger at night, the empty offices and conference rooms expanding in the darkness beyond his small sphere of light. He pushed through the front door into the night air. It was cooler than expected, cold enough that his breath misted. November in the Utah high desert could be unpredictable, warm afternoons giving way to near-freezing nights. Luis pulled his jacket tighter and started toward his truck. His keys were in his hand, the remote unlock button depressed when he realized his truck was 30 yards away but the parking lot lights hadn't triggered. The sensors were supposed to activate when motion was detected, had worked perfectly when he'd arrived 12 hours ago. Now the lot remained dark except for the dim glow from the station's entrance light behind him. Luis stopped walking. Every instinct he'd developed over years in law enforcement and backcountry work was screaming that something was wrong. The silence was too complete. Even the usual sounds of the desert night, Insects, distant coyotes, wind moving through sage were absent. The air itself felt thick, resistant, as if the darkness possessed substance. His truck was visible as a dark shape against the darker landscape. 10 more yards. Luis started walking again, faster now. The mag light in his left hand, keys in his right. His truck would have light, heat, a radio. The familiar comfort of steel and glass separating him from whatever his imagination was constructing. He was 5 yards away when he noticed the prints. They started near the station entrance and led toward his truck in a straight line. Luis swept the maglite beam across them, his analytical mind automatically cataloging details. Canine prints too large for a coyote. A wolf, maybe, though wolves were rare in this region. The gait was wrong, though. The spacing between prints suggested something running on 2 legs, not 4. As if an animal had reared up and walked upright for 20 yards before dropping back to all 4s. Luis followed the tracks with his light. They circled his truck once, twice, 3 times. Then they led away into the darkness, toward the trailhead where he'd seen the shape in the window. Every piece of his training said to get in the truck and drive away. To report the prints in the morning, let the wildlife biologists examine them in daylight, maintain professional distance from something his exhausted mind was probably misinterpreting. But his analytical nature demanded answers, needed to understand what he was seeing before filing it away in the categories of his experience. He walked to where the prints were clearest, crouched down with the mag light between his teeth and pulled his phone from his pocket. The camera flash seemed obscenely bright in the darkness. Luis took 3 shots from different angles, trying to capture the print's details. 4 toe pads, 1 large pad in back, classic canine morphology. But the size was wrong. And there, he leaned closer, something strange about the claw marks. Too long, almost like fingers, and the placement suggested a thumb. As if a hand had pressed into the dirt while wearing a glove shaped like a paw. The mag light flickered. Luis grabbed it from his mouth, tapped it against his palm. The beam steadied. He stood, suddenly aware of how exposed he was, crouched in the middle of an empty parking lot at 2:30 in the morning with his back to hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The prints led toward the Cave Springs trailhead. Luis followed them with the light, watching them grow clearer as they approached the trail marker. They should have looked like they were made by something running, disturbed, and scattered by the speed of movement. Instead, they were precise, deliberate, each print carefully placed as if whatever made them had been walking slowly, methodically. The tracks ended at the trailhead, not faded out or became unclear. They simply stopped. The last print was clear and deep, pressed into the hard earth with enough force to crack the surface. Beyond it, nothing. No tracks leading into the desert, no scuff marks or disturbance, just the end of a trail that should have continued. Luis stood at the threshold between the parking lot and the wilderness, light in hand, rational mind fighting against the rising certainty that he was seeing something that didn't fit the normal categories of wildlife behavior. He'd seen plenty of animal tracks in his years as a ranger. Bears, mountain lions, coyotes, bobcats. He'd even found the occasional print from someone's escaped dog or an animal from a neighboring ranch. These tracks didn't match anything in his experience. His phone vibrated. A text from Karen. "Still at the office? Go home. That's an order." Luis typed back. "Leaving now. Found some unusual tracks in the lot. We'll document in morning." The response was immediate. "Luis, sleep. The search needs you alert." He pocketed the phone and returned to his truck. The door locks clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence. Luis climbed in, started the engine, and let the familiar rumble of the diesel engine ground him. Heat began flowing from the vents. The radio display glowed green. Normal things, mechanical things, explicable things. He should have driven away, should have followed Karen's order and gone to the small house the park provided him 15 minutes down the highway. Instead, Luis found himself pulling up the photos he'd taken of the tracks on his phone. The images were clear enough despite the nighttime conditions. Clear enough to see what his eyes had registered but his mind had been reluctant to accept. The prints changed. In the first photo, they looked canine. In the second photo, taken from a different angle of prints 3 yards further along, They looked more human. Broader in the heel, distinct toe impressions that suggested feet rather than paws. In the third photo, they were canine again, but the size was different, smaller, as if the creature making them was shrinking or growing between steps. Luis zoomed in on the clearest image. The metadata showed it was taken at 2:31 a.m. His camera had GPS enabled. The coordinates placed him exactly where he'd been standing in the parking lot. But there was something else in the metadata, something his phone had captured that his eyes hadn't seen. In the corner of the frame, barely visible in the darkness beyond the flash's reach, was a reflection. Two eyes catching the light the way an animal's eyes would at night. But they were too high off the ground, at least 6 feet up, as if something tall was standing in the darkness watching him photograph the tracks it had left. Luis's hands were shaking again. He closed the photo app, set the phone in the cup holder, and put the truck in gear. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness as he drove toward the highway. He forced himself to watch the road, to not check the rearview mirror, to not look for shapes moving parallel to his truck in the darkness beyond the headlights' reach. But he looked anyway, and saw nothing. Just darkness. Empty, complete, impenetrable darkness that seemed to move with its own current when he looked at it directly but remained perfectly still in his peripheral vision. The drive to his house should have taken 15 minutes. Luis made it in 10, the truck's speedometer touching 80 on the straight sections of highway. No traffic, no other lights. Just the road and the darkness pressing against his windows. He pulled into his driveway, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden silence. His house looked exactly as he'd left it that morning. Porch light on, windows dark, the small yard with its struggling grass and native plants. Normal. Safe. The kind of place where rangers lived when they were assigned to remote parks. Government-issue housing that was functional rather than comfortable but served its purpose. Luis unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and immediately locked it behind him. The action made him feel foolish. He'd never locked his door during the day, had barely bothered at night. Crime was non-existent out here. The nearest neighbors were 3 miles away. He'd been more worried about bats getting in through gaps in the weather stripping than any human threat. But he locked the door, and checked the windows, and pulled the curtains closed in every room. The house had a small office where he kept his personal files and a desktop computer with a satellite internet connection. Luis booted up the machine and opened a browser. He needed information. Needed to understand what he was seeing through a lens wider than his training provided. He started with search terms he knew. Unusual animal tracks, Utah desert. The results were predictable. Identification guides for common wildlife, hiking blogs about animal encounters, scientific papers on desert ecosystem predator-prey relationships. Nothing that matched what he'd photographed. He tried different searches. Bipedal canine tracks. Animal tracks that change shape. Canine tracks with thumb. The results grew stranger. Forums about cryptozoology, blog posts about shapeshifters, links to websites with black backgrounds and red text that his internet security software flagged as potentially dangerous. Luis was about to give up when he found an academic paper buried in the results. Morphological anomalies in reported canine tracks, a systematic review of unexplained prints in North American wilderness areas. The author was a wildlife biologist at Northern Arizona University. The paper was published in a journal Luis had never heard of, something called Cryptozoological Research Quarterly. He downloaded the PDF, 47 pages of analysis, photographs, and witness testimonies. The author had collected reports from park rangers, wildlife officers, and hunters across the Southwest about tracks that didn't match known animals. The common elements were consistent. Prints that changed morphology between steps, tracks that appeared and disappeared without logical continuation, evidence of bipedal locomotion in species that should be quadrupedal, claw marks that resembled fingers, and this made Luis sit up straighter. A strong correlation with disappearances in the same areas where the anomalous tracks were found. The paper's conclusion was cautiously worded. While mainstream zoology has no framework for explaining these observations, the consistency of reports across diverse geographical regions and witness backgrounds suggests a phenomenon worthy of further investigation. Traditional wildlife biology may be insufficient for understanding apex predators that display adaptive mimicry extending beyond appearance to locomotive morphology. Adaptive mimicry. Luis read the phrase 3 times. The paper was suggesting something that could change not just its appearance, but the fundamental structure of how it moved. Something that could be a wolf one moment and something else the next. There was a footnote referencing traditional knowledge from various Native American tribes. Luis clicked through to the citation. It led to an anthropological study about Navajo beliefs, specifically regarding Yi-Nald-Lushi. He didn't recognize the term. The paper translated it as skinwalker, a type of harmful witch in Navajo tradition that could transform into animals. The source material was careful to note that these were cultural beliefs, not zoological claims, and should be understood in their proper context. But Luis kept reading. The descriptions matched what he'd seen, tracks that changed, something that walked on 2 legs and 4, a predator that hunted during the dark moon. The traditional accounts spoke of witches who wore animal skins to transform, who violated sacred taboos to gain the power of shapeshifting, who hunted humans in the deep wilderness where no one would hear their screams. Luis pushed back from the computer. His rational mind was fighting against the implications. He'd spent his adult life building an identity around logic and evidence, around understanding the world through patterns and data. Cryptozoology papers and folklore were outside his framework. There had to be a logical explanation. A wolf with a deformity, his fatigue causing him to misinterpret normal tracks, the power of suggestion after reading about disappearances. But he'd seen the prints change in his photographs, had seen something tall standing in the darkness, had felt the wrongness in the air when the night sounds disappeared. His phone rang. Luis jumped, his hand knocking over a coffee mug that he'd forgotten was there. Cold coffee spilled across his desk. He grabbed the phone, saw Karen's number. Ramirez. Where are you? Her voice was tight. Home. You told me to go home. I need you back here. Now. We got a call from Connor Burke's girlfriend. She's been getting text messages from his phone. Luis stood, already reaching for his jacket. What kind of messages? That's what's weird. They're not asking for help. They're not saying he's lost or hurt. He keeps texting the same thing over and over. Don't come looking, don't come looking, don't come looking. 17 texts in the last hour, all identical. The coffee was dripping onto the floor, but Luis didn't notice. Can you triangulate the signal? Already did. The texts are coming from Devil's Pocket, right where his GPS went dark. Luis, there's something else. The girlfriend says Connor's phone is a flip phone, an old Motorola. It doesn't have a keyboard. It's got T9 texting. She says there's no way he could type that message 17 times in an hour without making a single spelling error. Luis was out the door, keys in hand. I'm 10 minutes out. Drive careful. And Luis, those tracks you mentioned in your text, don't document them, don't photograph them, don't tell anyone else about them. Why? The silence stretched. Then, just don't. The line went dead. Luis drove back to the station with the speedometer buried, the truck's high beams carving a narrow tunnel through the darkness. The desert swept past on both sides, vast and empty and suddenly hostile in ways he'd never felt before. He'd driven this road hundreds of times, knew every curve and rise, could navigate it half asleep. Now it felt alien, as if the landscape itself had shifted when he wasn't looking. The station was fully lit when he arrived, every window glowing. 3 vehicles in the parking lot now. His truck, Karen's SUV, and a white pickup with a National Park service shield on the door that Luis recognized as belonging to Marcus de Leon, the senior ranger who oversaw operations for the entire district. Marcus rarely left his office in Moab unless something serious had developed. Luis parked and headed inside. Voices carried from the conference room. He followed them and found Karen and Marcus standing over a laptop. Connor Burke's missing persons file open on the table next to detailed topographic maps. Marcus looked up as Luis entered. He was in his late 50s, a career ranger with 3 decades of backcountry experience etched into the weathered creases of his face. Ramirez, good. Look at this. The laptop screen showed a text message thread, all from Connor's number, all saying the same thing. Don't come looking. The last one came in 15 minutes ago, Marcus said. I called the girlfriend myself. She's certain Connor wouldn't send these. Says he was excited about the hike, had been planning it for months. No reason he'd suddenly tell her to call off any search. Could someone have stolen his phone? Luis asked. Maybe whoever took him is trying to discourage rescue efforts. That's one theory, Karen said. She was standing with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Marcus has another theory. Marcus pulled up a file on the laptop, a scanned document old enough that the text had the fuzzy quality of something photocopied multiple times. This is from 1986. A ranger named Paul Fletcher was stationed here before Canyonlands was fully developed as a park. He filed this report and then requested a transfer 2 weeks later. Never worked for the Park Service again. I found it in the archives when I was looking into our missing persons history. Luis read the report. Fletcher described finding a hiker's campsite abandoned, gear still in place, food still in the tent. No sign of struggle. But Fletcher had found tracks leading away from the camp. Tracks that he described as morphologically inconsistent with any known wildlife. He'd followed them for 2 miles before they disappeared at the edge of a cliff. Fletcher noted that the tracks changed from canine to humanoid and back several times along the route. His report concluded with a recommendation that certain areas of the park be closed during the new moon phase. The recommendation was stamped "Denied" in red ink. A handwritten note in the margin read, Fletcher is clearly experiencing stress-related psychological symptoms. Recommend leave and psychiatric evaluation. Fletcher died in 2003, Marcus said. Lived alone in Nevada. Never married. Never talked about his time at Canyonlands. But I managed to track down another ranger who worked with him. Guy named Tom Hastings, retired now. I called him an hour ago. Hastings said Fletcher changed after he filed that report. Became paranoid. Started carrying a gun on patrol even though it was against policy. Told Hastings there were things in the canyons that the park administration refused to acknowledge. Things that hunted people. You think Fletcher was crazy, Luis said. I think Fletcher saw something that didn't fit his understanding of the world, Marcus replied. And I think you saw the same thing tonight. Karen forwarded me your text about the tracks. She also told me about your pattern analysis. 7 disappearances, all during the dark moon. And now we have Connor Burke texting his girlfriend from his last known location, telling her not to come looking. Luis sat down heavily. You're saying there's something out there, something that's not natural. I'm saying the Navajo Nation borders this park, Marcus said carefully. And the Navajo have stories about things that live in the wilderness, things that our scientific framework doesn't have names for. I've worked in the Southwest for 30 years, Luis. I've learned that sometimes the old stories are more accurate than our modern assumptions. Karen pulled up another file on the laptop. This is a linguistic analysis of the text messages. The girlfriend was right. The phone Connor was using has T9 predictive text. To type "don't come looking" would require 42 button presses. To do that 17 times without a single spelling error, you'd need to execute 7 14 button presses perfectly. The probability of that is essentially 0, especially for someone who's supposedly lost or injured in the backcountry. So something else is sending the messages, Luis said. Something that has Connor's phone, Marcus confirmed. Something that wants us to stay away from Devil's Pocket. The question is why? What's it doing with Connor? Why is it warning us off? Luis thought about the prints in the parking lot, the shape he'd seen at the trailhead, the eyes reflecting light from 6 feet up. It's hunting, and it doesn't want to be disturbed while it's feeding. The words hung in the air. Karen looked away. Marcus nodded slowly. The SAR team goes out in 3 hours, Marcus said. Protocol says we search for 72 hours before we consider a case a recovery instead of a rescue. Connor's been missing longer than that, but the text messages change the timeline. If he's alive enough to send texts, we have to treat this as an active rescue. But we're not sending them to Devil's Pocket, Luis said. You're going to redirect the search. I'm going to send them to areas where they'll be safe, Marcus corrected. Copper Ridge, Salt Creek, Horse Canyon, places with good sight lines and easy extraction routes. Places where there are no patterns of disappearances. And Devil's Pocket? Marcus closed the laptop. You and I are going to Devil's Pocket. Just us. We're going to find Connor Burke, or find out what happened to him. And we're going to do it during daylight because if the old stories are right, whatever is out there hunts at night. The stories also say skinwalkers can move in daylight, Karen said quietly. Both men looked at her. She shrugged. I grew up on the res. My grandmother told me stories. She said Yinald Lushi are witches, not animals. They're human, or were human before they violated the taboos. They can think. They can plan. They're not limited by animal behavior. Can they be killed? Luis asked. Karen's expression was grim. Grandmother said you call their real name, their human name, in front of witnesses. That breaks their power. But you have to know who they were before they transformed, and you have to be close enough to speak their name before they speak yours. Because if they speak your name first, Marcus prompted, then they own you, Karen finished. They can take your shape, use your voice, walk around wearing you like a skin. That's what skinwalker means. It doesn't just wear animal skins, it can wear any skin, including human. The conference room felt suddenly smaller. Luis thought about Connor Burke's phone, sending texts that the real Connor would never send. Thought about Paul Fletcher, the ranger who'd seen tracks that changed, who'd carried a gun and lived alone and died without ever talking about what he'd witnessed in the canyons. We leave at dawn, Marcus said. Bring your GPS, your radio, and your phone. Bring water for a day. We're going in light and fast. If we're not back by sunset, Karen calls in the cavalry. And if the cavalry comes looking for us? Luis asked. Marcus's jaw tightened. Then we've already failed. The sun rose over Canyonlands at 6:47 a.m., turning the red sandstone formations into bleeding wounds against the pale sky. Luis and Marcus loaded their packs in the parking lot, checking equipment with the methodical care of people who knew the backcountry could kill through carelessness as easily as malice. Water, GPS units, radios, first aid, emergency blankets, flares. Marcus added one more item from his personal vehicle, a Glock 23 in a hip holster. Department doesn't authorize firearms for search and rescue, Luis said. Department doesn't acknowledge what we're looking for, Marcus replied. He pulled a second gun from a lockbox in his truck, a revolver, and offered it to Luis. You know how to use one of these? Luis took the weapon, checked that it was loaded, verified the safety. My father taught me. We used to hunt deer in the mountains. Good. I hope we don't need them. But Karen's grandmother told her one more thing about skinwalkers. Marcus shouldered his pack. They die hard. Regular bullets might not be enough, but it's better than going unarmed. They took Marcus's truck to the trailhead at Devil's Pocket, a 6-mile drive on increasingly rough dirt roads that left the maintained park areas behind. The landscape grew more desolate with each mile, fewer signs of human presence, more evidence of the raw geological forces that had shaped this country over millions of years. Canyons cut deep into the earth. Wind-sculpted rock formations rose like ancient monuments. The vegetation thinned to scattered sage and the occasional twisted juniper clinging to life in cracks in the stone. The trailhead was nothing more than a widening in the road where vehicles could park. No facilities, no signs, no markers to indicate that humans had ever been here before. The trail itself was barely visible, just a faint track leading into a narrow canyon. Marcus killed the engine. In the sudden silence, Luis could hear the wind moving through the rocks. A low moan that sounded almost organic, almost like breathing. Connor's last GPS coordinates put him 3 miles in, Marcus said, studying his own GPS unit. The canyon narrows to a slot in about a mile, then opens up again into a box canyon. Devil's Pocket. Old-timers called it that because things go in and don't come out. Encouraging, Luis muttered. Stay close. Stay alert. If you see tracks, point them out but don't touch them. If you hear something that sounds like a voice calling your name, don't answer. If you see something that looks like Connor Burke, wait for me to verify before approaching. You think it might be wearing him, Luis said. not a question. I think we need to be prepared for anything. They started down the trail. The canyon walls rose on either side, red Navajo sandstone layered in bands that recorded hundreds of millions of years of geological history. The trail followed what would be a stream bed during the rare desert rains, the floor smooth and hard from water erosion. Their boots made soft scuffing sounds on the rock. Luis checked his GPS every few minutes, watching their progress. The satellite signal was good here, 5 bars, clear reading. But he couldn't shake the memory of Connor's GPS going dark at 9:47 p.m. Something had stopped the signal. Something in this canyon. They walked in silence, conserving energy, focusing on the terrain. The canyon began to narrow. The walls closed in from 70 feet apart to 50, then 30. The sky became a strip of blue overhead, the sun not yet high enough to reach the canyon floor. Shadows pooled in the narrows, deep and cool and complete. Marcus stopped. Luis nearly walked into him. There, Marcus pointed, tracks in the sand of the canyon floor, fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. Luis crouched to examine them, careful not to touch. Canine prints, large, spaced as if the animal was walking. He pulled out his phone and took a photo. When he reviewed the image, his breath caught. The print he'd photographed looked different from the print he was staring at. In the photo, it was humanoid. 5 toes, a clear heel, the shape of a bare foot pressed into the sand. "Marcus," Luis said quietly. The older ranger was already looking at his own phone, comparing the live view to the captured image. "It's happening again, just like Fletcher described. The tracks are changing depending on how we look at them." "That's not possible." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not." They stood in the shadows of the narrow canyon, staring at prints that refused to hold a consistent shape. Luis's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the cognitive dissonance of watching his understanding of reality break down. "We keep moving," Marcus said. "We're committed now." The canyon widened again after another quarter mile. The slot gave way to a broader floor, maybe 60 feet across, with vertical walls rising 200 feet on either side. The sun had climbed high enough to illuminate the space, though shadows still clung to the base of the walls. And there, in the middle of the open area, was Connor Burke's tent. It was set up properly, stakes driven into the sand, rainfly secured. Connor's pack leaned against it. His boots were arranged neatly by the entrance, laces tied. A water bottle sat beside them, still half full. The camp looked like its owner had just stepped away for a moment, but the tent entrance was open, and there was blood on the zipper. Marcus drew his gun. Luis followed suit. They approached the camp from opposite sides, giving each other angles of coverage, moving with the careful coordination of people who understood tactical approaches. "Connor Burke," Marcus called. "This is Park Service. If you can hear me, respond." Nothing. Just wind. Luis reached the tent first. He could see inside through the open entrance. Sleeping bag neatly rolled. Stove and cooking gear organized in one corner. A paperback book with a bookmark holding a page. Everything normal. Everything except the blood. It was on the inside of the tent entrance, as if someone had grabbed the zipper from inside with a bleeding hand. Not a lot of blood. Just enough to smear the fabric, to leave a pattern that suggested fingers. "Empty," Luis reported. Marcus was examining the ground around the tent. No signs of struggle, no drag marks, no blood trail. Whoever bled on that zipper either stopped bleeding immediately or didn't leave the tent through the entrance. Then how did they leave? Marcus pointed to the tent's back wall. There was a vertical slit in the fabric 6 feet long, cut cleanly from top to bottom. The edges of the cut were straight, surgical. Someone had sliced open the tent from the inside with something very sharp. "Connor had a knife," Luis said, pulling up the missing persons file on his phone. 4-inch fixed blade, K-bar. It's on his equipment list. Would he cut his own tent? Not unless something was very wrong. They moved around to the back of the tent. More tracks. These started at the slit and led away into the canyon, heading deeper into Devil's Pocket. The prints were clear in the morning light. Human feet. Bare feet. Running. But after 20 yards, they changed to canine, and after another 20 yards, they disappeared entirely, as if whatever made them had simply lifted off the ground and flown. Marcus followed the tracks to where they ended, stood staring at the blank sand beyond. This is where his GPS stopped transmitting. Right here. Luis checked his own GPS unit. 5 bars. Good signal. He marked their location, noting the coordinates matched Connor's last known position within 10 meters. Something took him from here, Luis said. Something that can walk like a human and run like an animal. Something that made Connor cut his way out of his tent in the middle of the night. The texts, Marcus said suddenly. Karen said he's been texting since last night, but if something took him 3 days ago, who's been sending the messages? They stood in the canyon, surrounded by walls of ancient stone, and considered the implications. Connor Burke was gone. Something else had his phone, his identity, his ability to communicate with the outside world. And it was using that stolen identity to warn people away. It's intelligent, Luis said. Whatever this is, it thinks, it plans. It's not just hunting, it's controlling the situation. Marcus's radio crackled. Karen's voice, distorted by the canyon walls, but understandable. Marcus, Luis, check in. Marcus unclipped the radio. We're at Burke's camp. Tent is here, equipment present, no sign of Burke. Evidence of blood and forced exit from the tent. Tracks leading into the canyon, but they terminate 30 yards out. No logical explanation for disappearance of trail. Static. Then, are you in Devil's Pocket proper? The box canyon? Affirmative. Get out. Now. I just heard from the SAR team. They found something at Copper Ridge. Footprints. Human footprints. They're following them and... Her voice cut off, replaced by static. Karen? Marcus pressed the transmit button. Karen, respond. Nothing but hiss. Luis checked his phone. No signal. He'd had 5 bars 30 seconds ago. Now the screen showed no service, searching for network. Something's jamming us, Marcus said. He tried the radio again. Dead air. Then, from deeper in the canyon, a voice called out, "Help! Someone help me! I'm hurt!" Connor Burke's voice. Luis and Marcus looked at each other. The voice came again, desperate, panicked. "Please, my leg! I can't move! Help!" "That's not him," Luis said quietly. "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not." The voice called again, and this time Luis heard the wrongness in it. The tone was right, the words were appropriate, but there was something off about the cadence, as if someone was reading a script, hitting the emotional marks but missing the genuine humanity underneath. "Help. Please, is someone there?" Marcus raised his gun, pointing it toward the source of the voice. The canyon bent ahead, curving to the left. Whatever was calling was around that bend, out of sight. "We leave," Marcus said. "Now, back the way we came." They turned toward the slot canyon entrance and stopped. There were prints in the sand, fresh prints, leading from the slot to where they stood. The same morphing tracks they'd followed in, except these tracks hadn't been here 5 minutes ago. They'd appeared while Luis and Marcus were examining the tent. Something had followed them in, something that was now between them and the exit. "Alternative route?" Luis asked, keeping his voice level. Marcus pulled out his topographic map, studied it with the GPS for orientation. "Box Canyon, only one way in and out unless we're willing to climb. The walls here are maybe Class 4, technical climbing. We don't have gear, we don't have time. So we go forward, toward the voice, toward whatever is pretending to be Connor Burke." They moved deeper into Devil's Pocket, weapons drawn, backs to each other, watching both ahead and behind. The canyon walls seemed to lean in, the sky narrowing above them. The temperature dropped despite the sunlight. Luis's breath misted in front of his face. The voice called again, closer now. "I can see you. Thank God. I thought I was going to die out here." They rounded the bend. The canyon opened into a wider area, almost circular, maybe 100 feet across. The walls here were sheer, rising smooth and unbroken to the sky. This was the pocket, the dead end that gave the place its name. Connor Burke stood in the center of the clearing. He looked exactly like his photographs. Same build, same curly brown hair, same hiking clothes described in the missing person report. He was waving his arms, limping, one leg apparently injured. His face showed relief at seeing them. "Thank God," he called out. "I fell 3 days ago. Thought I was going to die. My phone died this morning. I couldn't call for help. Thank God you found me." Marcus kept his gun raised. "Connor Burke?" Yes, that's me. Are you Park Service?" "I need medical attention. My leg might be broken." "Where's your tent?" Connor gestured vaguely back the way they'd come. "Back there. I tried to walk out, but my leg gave out. I've been trying to crawl, but it's too far." "Your phone died this morning?" Luis asked. "Yeah, battery gave out. I tried to conserve it, but..." Connor trailed off, confusion crossing his face. "Wait, how did you find me if my phone died? How did you know where to look?" Marcus and Luis said nothing. They watched Connor Burke limp toward them, favoring his right leg, grimacing with pain. Every detail was perfect, every movement appropriate for someone injured and exhausted. But there was no shadow beneath his feet. The sun was high enough to cast shadows from the canyon walls, from Marcus and Luis, from the rocks and scrub vegetation. But Connor Burke, standing in full sunlight, cast nothing. He was a figure without darkness, a presence that didn't quite occupy space. "Stop walking," Marcus ordered. Connor stopped. "What's wrong?" "Your name," Luis said. "Say your full name." "Connor Michael Burke." "Look, I don't understand. What's your girlfriend's name?" "Sarah. Sarah Chen. She must be worried sick. Did she report me missing? Is that how you..." Marcus fired. The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, echoing off the canyon walls and coming back amplified. The bullet should have hit Connor center mass. Instead, Connor blurred. His form shifted, stretched, became something else. The human shape collapsed into an animal form. A wolf, lean and gray and twice as large as any wolf Luis had ever seen. Then the wolf became something else, something that didn't have a name in any language Luis knew. It was tall, angular, with limbs that bent at wrong angles and a head that was neither canine nor human but some nightmare fusion of both. The thing that had been Connor Burke screamed, not with Connor's voice, with something ancient and furious and hungry. Then it ran at them. Marcus fired again. The bullet passed through the creature without apparent effect. Luis aimed and pulled the trigger, the revolver kicking in his hand. The creature didn't slow. They ran. The slot canyon was 30 yards away. Luis covered the distance faster than he'd ever moved, adrenaline overriding exhaustion and fear. Behind him, he could hear the thing that wasn't Connor, could hear its footsteps changing from human to animal and back, could hear it laughing with Connor's voice while making sounds no human throat could produce. They hit the slot at full speed, the walls narrowing around them, the shadows swallowing the sunlight. The thing followed so close Luis could hear its breathing, could smell something like wet dog and rotting meat and ozone. "Name!" Marcus shouted as he ran. "Karen said to speak its name." "We don't know its name." "Then we're dead." The slot canyon seemed to stretch on forever. Luis's lungs burned. His legs were cramping. Behind them, the creature was laughing, playing with them, letting them run because it knew they had nowhere to go. Then Luis saw light ahead. The slot was ending, opening back up into the wider canyon near the trailhead. If they could reach Marcus's truck, if they could get back to the station... They burst out of the slot into full daylight. Luis didn't slow down, sprinted toward where they'd parked. Marcus's truck sat exactly where they'd left it, faithful and mechanical and real. They reached it. Marcus fumbled for his keys, dropped them, grabbed them up. The creature emerged from the slot canyon behind them, no longer running. Walking now, taking its time. In the daylight, Luis could see it clearly. It was wearing Connor Burke's shape again, but imperfectly. The proportions were slightly wrong, the movements too fluid. The eyes reflected light like an animal's, glowing yellow even in full sun. "Connor Burke," Louise shouted. "That's not your name. That's not who you are." The creature smiled with Connor's face. "No," it agreed. "But it's a good skin. Better than some. The girlfriend will be sad. I might visit her, might wear this face and knock on her door. Might—" "What's your real name?" Marcus demanded. "What were you before?" The smile widened. "I was Paul Fletcher. Remember him? The ranger who saw things, who tried to warn everyone. No one believed him, so I made him into me. Now I'm anyone I want to be." Luis felt ice in his stomach. Paul Fletcher, the ranger who'd filed the report in 1986. The ranger who'd lived alone and died without ever talking about what he'd seen in the canyons. "Fletcher died in 2003, Marcus said. "Fletcher became me in 1987, the creature corrected. I wore him until he was no use anymore. Then I let him die. I've worn others since. Rangers mostly. People who come alone into the wilderness. People no one believes when they try to warn." "Why?" Luis asked. "Why do you hunt people?" The creature tilted its head, a gesture that was utterly inhuman despite the human face. "Because I'm hungry. Because I was human once and I remember what humanity tastes like. Because the taboos I broke to become this demand payment in flesh. Because I can." "We know what you are," Marcus said. "We know how to stop you." "No," the creature said. "You know stories, but stories are just words. I am real." It moved. One moment it stood 10 yards away. The next it was on Marcus, moving faster than physics should allow. Connor Burke's face opened like a flower, revealing teeth that had nothing to do with human anatomy. Marcus screamed. Luis fired. The bullet hit the creature in its true form, struck something vital. It shrieked and pulled back from Marcus, leaving him bleeding on the ground. The creature's stolen face was gone now. What remained was something that had never been fully human, something that had worn humanity like a costume, but forgotten how to take the shape all the way off. "Paul Fletcher," Luis shouted. "I call you by your true name. Paul Fletcher, you are known." The creature froze. It looked at Luis with eyes that suddenly showed recognition, showed something like fear. The flesh began to shift, revealing the thing underneath. It wasn't Connor Burke. It wasn't Paul Fletcher either, not anymore. It was something that had consumed both identities and left only hunger behind. But Luis speaking the name, calling it out with certainty and witnesses, even if Marcus was barely conscious, that had power. The old stories were right about that much. The creature's form began to collapse. The stolen shapes fell away like dead skin. What remained was surprisingly small, pathetically human. An old man, naked and shivering, covered in filth and dried blood. Paul Fletcher as he'd been in 1987, the year he'd disappeared into the canyons and never come back. "Help me," Fletcher whispered. "Please, it's been so long, I can't remember what I was before. I can't remember my own face." Luis kept the gun raised. "You killed 7 people. You wore their skins. You're still wearing Connor Burke." "I was hungry," Fletcher said. His voice was weak, human, pathetic. "I'm always hungry. The taboo can't be undone. Once you taste human flesh, once you take a skin, you can't go back. You just get hungrier, and hungrier, and you do anything to feed." "Where's Connor Burke?" Luis demanded. Fletcher smiled, and for a moment the monster showed through. "Everywhere. Parts of him anyway. In the canyon, in me, in the earth. I'm wearing his phone, his name, his face when I remember how. But Connor's been gone for days." Marcus groaned, trying to sit up. Luis kept his attention on Fletcher, knowing the old man could transform again at any moment, could become the monster that had chased them through the slot. "You're going to die here," Luis said. "Called by name, witnessed, exposed. That breaks your power. The stories say so." "Stories," Fletcher laughed. The sound was bitter, exhausted. "Stories are how humans cope with what they can't understand. I am what I am, named or not, witnessed or not. I will be hungry tomorrow. and the next day, and the day after that. And people will keep coming into the canyons, and I will keep feeding. Not anymore. Luis fired. The bullet took Fletcher in the chest. The old man fell, human blood spreading in the dirt. He looked up at Luis with something like gratitude. "Thank you," Fletcher whispered. "I couldn't stop. Even when I wanted to, the hunger was too much. Thank you for ending it." He died with Connor Burke's phone in his hand, the screen cracked but still displaying the text messages he'd sent. "Don't come looking. Don't come looking. Don't come looking." Luis helped Marcus to the truck. The wounds weren't as bad as they'd looked. Deep scratches, bleeding heavily but not life-threatening. They drove back to the station in silence, Marcus pressing a first aid compress to his shoulder while Luis gripped the wheel with white knuckles. Karen met them in the parking lot. She looked at Marcus's injuries, at Luis's expression, and didn't ask questions. She called for medical assistance, filed the initial report, and started the process that would keep the story contained. The official record would say they found evidence of Connor Burke's death in Devil's Pocket. Animal attack, most likely a mountain lion. The body was not recovered due to the terrain and the extent of the injuries. The case was closed as a fatality. Connor's family received condolences and the return of his personal effects, minus the phone which was kept as evidence. Marcus took early retirement. The scratches healed but left scars, the kind that hurt in the cold and reminded him of the day he learned that the old stories were maps rather than myths. He moved to Nevada, as far from canyon country as he could get while staying in the Southwest. Luis stayed. Someone had to. Someone who understood what lived in the backcountry, who could recognize the signs, who could watch for patterns that repeated during the dark moon. He found 3 more cases over the next 2 years. 3 times he went into the wilderness alone, knowing what he was looking for, knowing how to call it by name when he found it. 3 times he came back with 1 less disappearance on his records and 1 more nightmare to carry. The thing about skinwalkers, he learned, was that they were never just one. Paul Fletcher had been one, but the hunger spread like a disease. Others would violate the taboos. Others would taste forbidden meat. Others would learn to wear stolen faces. All Luis could do was watch. Wait. And when the patterns emerged during the dark moon, he would go into the canyons with a gun and the old stories and the knowledge that some hungers could never be satisfied, only stopped. The wilderness was vast. The canyons were deep. And somewhere in the darkness between the stone walls, something was always hungry. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.